This presentation is designed to provide a high-level overview of the control system and the creation of the Beatles as a social engineering tool. For those interested in a deeper dive into the Beatles conspiracy, the description box has links to my key presentations on the topic. To gain a more thorough understanding of the deep state structure, I strongly suggest that people conduct their own research. A question that I get asked a lot by people who are not familiar with the Beatles research is, why is the McCartney and Beatles conspiracy important? People will say, if it's true, what's the big deal? They just replaced the guy in the band. Or they might say, I never liked the Beatles anyway. Or, none of it matters because the music was great. These types of responses reflect the mindset that has been influenced by pop culture and is ubiquitous throughout today's society, regardless of the topic being discussed. Pop culture is the culture that was sold to the world, especially the West, through television sets and other mass media outlets. The aim was to diminish critical thinking skills by persuading individuals to allocate their time and intellectual capacity to meaningless pursuits. To achieve this, the appeal of pop culture needs to be pervasive, and in fact, it is. It can be found in television, Hollywood, social media, fast food, alcohol, drugs, porn, music, sports, and so on. In addition to reducing critical thinking, the control system used pop culture to eliminate traditional cultures that people were connected to through their family heritage. The values associated with traditional or ancestral culture help define a person's individuality. However, individualism is in direct conflict with the Marxist ideology of collectivism. Thus, culture that is based on traditions and ancestry is being replaced by an artificial homogenized construct that was created by social scientists. A population that does not have a connection to their ancestry will ultimately lead to groupthink, where consensus is given priority over critical evaluation. To understand the significance of the McCartney and Beatles conspiracy, we must first understand the system behind it. The control system uses official narratives to shape the minds of the population. Many of these narratives, particularly the significant ones, are based on events, movements, or lifestyles that were engineered and then promoted as natural occurrences through social engineering and propaganda. These narratives are repeated over and over until they become a fact in the minds of the controlled masses. To quote Joseph Goebbels, if you tell a big lie and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. This was also the approach used by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, a faction of Russian Marxists. The control system is made up of an intricate web of aristocratic bloodlines and a federation of secret societies, with Freemasonry being the most recognized. They are highly educated in the occult and claim to have the divine right to rule over the world. The fundamental ideology of the controllers for governing and managing populations worldwide is Marxism. The control system's objective is to attain a technocratic Marxist one-world system of governance, which is commonly known as the New World Order. The priesthood that drives the Marxist framework is heavily influenced by the ancient Egyptian and Babylonian mysteries, as well as Kabbalistic and Jewish mysticism. Aleister Crowley's ideology and religion of Thelema tap into the same sources, which is why Crowley's principles and teachings are very prominent in the system of control. Behind the scenes, Egyptian mythology and Crowley's ideology permeate the Beatles as an entity. Occult symbolism is visible on all of the Beatles album covers. Obvious examples would be the Beatles' second UK album, With the Beatles, which displays one-eye symbolism. The cover of their fifth UK album, Help, has the Beatles displaying Crowley's ritual signs, depicting the story of the Egyptian gods Osiris, Isis, Set, and Horus. In spite of what we were told, the Beatles are not spelling out the word help in semaphore. Sgt. Pepper is in a league of its own and far too involved to get into with this presentation. If you're curious about the details of the album cover, I recommend reading memoirs for a detailed discussion. The spiritual mindset of the controllers, if we can call it that, is often described as Luciferian or satanic. In the memoirs of Billy Shears, Crowley is referred to as the father of modern Satanism. Two cults that closely align with Luciferian beliefs are the cult of Dionysus and the cult of Pan, of which Crowley was a member. The ancient Greek god Pan was associated with shepherds, hunters, wild mountains, forests, and meadows. He is often depicted as half man, half goat, with a beard and a snub nose, and is often shown playing his signature instrument, the panpipes. He is the god of vegetation and represents the manifestation of nature. Pan is the god of unrestrained bodily instincts and sexuality that runs rampant, and no social force can stop him. He is the lord of death, corruption, bodily decay, and dissolution. He is also the mindless mob instinct and the beast that takes control of man. Crowley's philosophy of pursuing one's true will embodies the mythology of Pan. The mythology of Pan is also the basis for the story of the Pied Piper, and the word pied means multicolored. On the Sgt. Pepper album cover, we see the four Beatles in multicolored or pied outfits. Each band member is holding a wind instrument, which is a nod to Pan and his flute. The Beatles are representing the cult of Pan, and by association, the ideology of Crowley's religion of Thelema. The Beatles are being presented as Pied Pipers. The Beatles and their music were instrumental in leading their followers into a new age, known as the Age of Aquarius, or what Crowley referred to as the Aeon of Horus. The counterculture of the 1960s was known as the Aquarian Conspiracy. The controllers devised a plan to establish a cult surrounding the Beatles that draws inspiration from and conforms to the cult of Pan. That cult is referred to as Paulism. Paulism is a religion that has fans idolizing and worshipping the Beatles and Paul McCartney. The Church of the Beatles, with its congregation of millions, has been led by their Pied Pipers into the New Age. Paulism is a play on Christian Paulism or Pauline theology, which was developed from the beliefs and doctrines espoused by Paul the Apostle through his writings. The Beatles version was not done as a tribute to the Christian faith, but to mock it. In March of 1966, John Lennon said that Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. He stated that he didn't need to argue about it because he is right and will be proved right, and added that the Beatles were now more popular than Jesus. In another interview, Lennon said that by 2012, the masses will be where we are today, and Paul should be Jesus by then.
They burned their records and spit on their images. But before they burned the records, they had to buy them.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did. I was just saying it as a fact. I was using expressions on things that I just read.
The Passover plot speculates that the Bible is a hoax and that Jesus didn't die on the cross. Jesus survived, and in order to create a new religion with himself as the Messiah, he made people believe that he'd risen from the dead.
He said to me once that the children of 2000 will be listening to the Beatles.
By 2012, the masses will be where we are today, and Paul should be Jesus by then.
2012 is an interesting date because it was the year of all the Mayan calendar hoopla. There are astrologers that believe that December 21st, 2012, the winter solstice, was actually the beginning of the Age of Aquarius. In the context of the occultism surrounding the Beatles, it meant that Jesus and the Christian Piscean Age had ended, and the New Age, the Aeon of Horus, which the Beatles helped to spearhead, had begun. I have explained in many presentations that Tavistock excels at creating cults and lowering the critical thinking capacity of adults to that of children. By people attaching themselves and following and worshiping bands, entertainers, celebrities, politicians, technology gurus, social media influencers, etc., they place themselves into categories that can be manipulated. The manipulation takes place through music, entertainment, mass media, and especially social media. All of these mechanisms release a constant barrage of pop culture stimuli that leaves many people in a dumbed-down or childlike mental state that is incapable of critical thinking. An individual who has a cult mindset and cannot think for themselves is easily controlled. The brilliant part of the brainwashing, as evil as it is that people who are programmed don't know they are programmed. They are blind to the fact that their thoughts are not their own. And worse, they are unwittingly defending and enabling the paradigms and agendas that social scientists have placed in their heads. One programming tactic is the Marxist strategy and approach, which divides society into two categories, oppressors and victims. This approach was articulated by the Frankfurt School and was referred to as critical theory. The Frankfurt School was formed in 1923 by the Marxist George Lukács, who asked the question, who will save us from Western civilization? To transform a culture, Lukács and his cadre of communists and Bolsheviks believed that identifying oppressors and victims was necessary. It didn't matter if the oppressor was actually oppressing or if the victims were really victims. What mattered was the victim's perception of being victimized. To generate this perception, the controllers systematically bombarded the masses with propaganda which came from television, radio, movies, books, and other media. Gaslighting the target population is a technique that has worked extremely well and is still used today. In the practice of gaslighting, one person intentionally undermines another's perception of reality. As a result of this, the target person begins to question their own memories, judgments, and sanity. The ultimate goal, as described by Bertrand Russell, a member of the Fabian Society, was to produce an unshakable conviction that snow is black. Or as Max Horkheimer, a prominent member of the Frankfurt School, said, the revolution won't happen with guns. Rather, it will happen incrementally, year by year, generation by generation. We will gradually infiltrate their educational institutions and political offices, transforming them slowly into Marxist entities as we work towards universal egalitarianism. It is important to note that universal egalitarianism is just another term for universal Marxism. Other prominent individuals from the Frankfurt School include Walter Benjamin, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, and Erich Fromm. All of the above-mentioned individuals were Marxists, German, and members of the Jewish intellectual community. Germany was undoubtedly a center of Marxist philosophy as well as the home of the Rothschilds, who hail from Frankfurt. Is it possible that this is the reason why the Beatles were sent to Hamburg, which is often referred to as Germany's media capital? The victim-oppressor dialectic is also represented in Crowley's concept of the eons. In particular, the shift from the Eon of Osiris to the Eon of Horus. Crowley espoused that the Eon of Osiris, representing the Christian Piscean Age, was a period of oppression where humanity was bound by laws and rules, including religion, and that his Eon of Horus, or the Age of Aquarius, represents an age of liberation. The question arises as to whether the Eon of Horus is a time of enlightenment for everyone or just the elite class. Given that Crowley was a British spy and propagandist during World War I and part of the elite establishment, I highly doubt that he had a vision that extended beyond the inner circle of his cohorts. There are mythologists who equate the Age of Aquarius with Lucifer. The connection is traced back to the Luciferian characteristics of the Sumerian god Enki. Enki was known for his wisdom, magic, abilities to create, and mastery of the freshwater realms. Of course, water is linked to the Age of Aquarius. If Enki is a variation of Lucifer and the ruler of the freshwater realms, it implies that the Age of Aquarius is the Age of Lucifer. In other words, the water bearer is the light bearer. So what we have is an occult internationalist apparatus that is determined to restructure the world and rule it through a Marxist system of governance. As Max Horkheimer explained, it will be accomplished incrementally, year by year, and generation by generation. Let's now discuss the Tavistock Institute, which was established 3 years before the Frankfurt School. In 1920, after World War I, the Tavistock Clinic was created as an offshoot of Wellington House, which was the British military's propaganda department during the war. The clinic, originally founded in 1920 by Dr. Hugh Crichton Miller, was established with principles influenced by psychoanalysis, the field Sigmund Freud pioneered. Their stated objective was to study and aid World War I soldiers in overcoming shell shock. However, their real objective was to conduct psychological experiments to further develop and advance human mind control techniques. It was known as the Freudian Hilton due to Sigmund Freud's association with the clinic and Freud's daughter, Dr. Anna Freud, becoming a leading figure. It's worth mentioning that Sigmund Freud had a close connection with the Jewish fraternal order known as B'nai B'rith. B'nai B'rith is described as an international Jewish service group founded in New York City in 1843 by 12 German Jews, with Masonic traditions serving as the foundation of the organization. B'nai B'rith has been instrumental in the establishment of significant Jewish institutions, including the Anti-Defamation League and other Jewish activist organizations. What we can discern from Freud's associations, aside from being the poster child for Tavistock, is that he was also a Marxist and Freemason. It's also worth noting that Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, was instrumental in the establishment of the modern public relations industry, using his uncle's psychoanalytic theories to influence public opinion and consumer behavior. Edward Bernays had a close connection with the Tavistock Institute, both because of his family relationship with Sigmund Freud and his professional work in public relations and social engineering. He was instrumental in the popularization of Freudian psychoanalytic ideas in the United States and helped establish the intellectual foundation for the Institute's work on group psychology and mass manipulation. The clinic was taken over in 1932 by Dr. John Rawling Rees, a key figure in British Army intelligence. During the Second World War, Rees held the position of Brigadier General and was an expert in psychiatric warfare. Subsequently, Tavistock became the psychological warfare branch of the British military and intelligence services. In 1946, Tavistock was upgraded to become the central laboratory for developing hardcore brainwashing techniques and received a massive infusion of funds from the Rockefeller Foundation. In 1947, the clinic became the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. In 1948, Rees became president of the UN-linked World Federation of Mental Health, which became a major conduit for British operations in psychological warfare. Tavistock is the hub for mass mind manipulation and social engineering activities worldwide. It is a sophisticated organization used to shape the destiny of the world by changing the paradigms of modern society. Tavistock collaborates with other internationalist think tanks and has control mechanisms in academia, corporations, multimedia, intelligence, medicine, pharmaceuticals, and so on. Its range of disciplines includes anthropology, economics, organizational behavior, political science, psychoanalysis, psychology, and sociology. Think of Tavistock as the social engineering headquarters for the world. The control system, which Tavistock is part of, is organized in the same way as a corporation. It has a board of directors that includes noble and royal bloodlines, banking and industrialist families, secret societies, policy think tanks, and political and military groups, such as the Council on Foreign Relations, NATO, and major political parties. The board in particular is exempt from laws, taxes, and oversight that are imposed on the rest of humanity. This exemption is also explained in Dr. John Coleman's book on the Committee of 300. According to Coleman, the committee refers to itself as the Olympians. Tavistock social engineers and scientists, employing their Frankfurt ideology, produce and implement engineered events and movements, including the creation of music genres, to alter societal and cultural structures. A common thread across the Frankfurt School, Tavistock, and virtually all deep state social engineering and brainwashing efforts is the exploitation of psychology and the promotion of hedonism to create behavior modification. The porn industry is a clear example of promoting hedonism. Various studies suggest that the pornography industry worldwide is estimated to earn between $97 and $100 billion in annual revenue. The precursor to the Beatles and the counterculture of the 1960s was the Marxist Beat movement. The members of the Beat generation developed a reputation as new bohemian hedonists who celebrated nonconformity and spontaneous creativity, which was another nod to the cult of Pan. The movement traces its roots back to the 1940s with key figures like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, and Neal Cassady. Although the movement's core ideas were forming in the late 1940s, it entered the public consciousness in the 1950s, gaining widespread attention with the publication of Allen Ginsberg's 1956 poem Howl, Jack Kerouac's 1957 novel On the Road, and William S. Burroughs' Naked Lunch in 1959. British beat poet and writer Royston Ellis had an association in the early history of the Beatles. Legend has it that it was Ellis who suggested that the band change their name from Beatles with 2 E's to Beatles with an A to reflect their connection to the beat movement. From an occult perspective, the band's name is also a reference to the scarab beetle. The scarab beetle was a symbol of transformation, rebirth, and protection in ancient Egyptian belief systems, and it had great occult and spiritual significance. It's worth mentioning that John Lennon admired both Royston Ellis and Jack Kerouac. Beat writer William S. Burroughs was featured on the cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album. In the 1960s, the beat movement was integrated into the hippie and larger counterculture movements and had a significant impact on rock and roll and popular music. Their influence extended beyond the Beatles to include Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, the Grateful Dead, Jim Morrison, and many other bands and entertainers. The Beatles' music, especially their later albums, showed a shift towards more experimental and spiritually exploring themes corresponding with the beat philosophy of challenging conventions and seeking new experiences. The Marxist approach to implement their strategy of their one world order was done in stages. According to Dr. John Coleman's book on the Rothschilds, the First World War was fought to establish Bolshevism in Russia, as well as a home for the Jews in Palestine, as spelled out by the Balfour Declaration. During World War I, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, a public statement that expressed support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This declaration marked the first formal endorsement of Zionism by a major world power and became a foundational moment in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Second World War was fought to destroy Germany and Japan, establish the USSR as a communist world power, and extend Bolshevism's reach over 3/4 of the world. The Second World War also had a major impact on the makeup of the United States due to the influence of international communists in prominent positions. The United States transformed from a constitutional republic to an imperial force that aimed to dominate the world in the name of communism. Behind these changes stood the power, money, and plotting of the Rothschilds. It's important to note that after World War II, the United States was targeted to be systematically subverted in order to dismantle the country's core values and traditions. It's not a coincidence that the Beatles and the British invasion bands arrived in America less than 20 years after the end of the war. Conquering America was the ultimate prize for the Marxists, which would ensure their goal of world dominance. When the Beatles arrived in the States in February of 1964, one of their taglines was, "The Beatles Conquer America." This short history lesson on the hidden operations behind the scenes demonstrates that there is a control system with a very specific purpose. The objective of that agenda is to implement Marxist ideology worldwide and to manage the governance system through technology. The primary approach to implement Marxist ideology was through a strategy referred to as cultural Marxism. Cultural Marxism is a term that has often been associated with the Frankfurt School. In contemporary discourse, it is used to talk about how Marxist theory is applied to cultural and societal structures instead of traditional economic class struggles. The focus is on the power structures that exist in cultural institutions such as media, education, and religion. As Max Horkheimer explained, cultural Marxism is about subversion from within. Social engineering is all about altering behavior. Music and entertainment are essential tools for social scientists. Both the music industry and entertainment, with Hollywood being a notable example, can have a tremendous impact on morals, beliefs, and lifestyles, and the social scientists at Tavistock and their network of enablers are well versed in this. During the presentation thus far, I have referred to Marxism, communism, and Bolshevism almost interchangeably, and that's because there is significant overlap between the three. Developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, Marxism is a socio-economic and political theory analyzing class structure and advocating for a classless, stateless society. Communism is a political and economic system derived from Marxist theory. In its ideal form, as described by Marx, Communism is a society without states and classes, with shared ownership of the means of production. Bolshevism was an application of Marxism and the revolutionary socialist movement led by Vladimir Lenin. After the 1917 October Revolution, Bolshevism became the foundation of the Soviet Union, later known as Marxist-Leninist ideology. At their core, Marxism, communism, and Bolshevism are all Jewish ideologies and movements. John Lennon made a notable comment regarding Jewish involvement in the music business, stating that, quote, show business is an extension of Jewish religion. His remark, often cited in discussions about the history of the Beatles, reflects Lennon's observation of the significant role Jews played in the post-war British and American entertainment industries. The comment was reported to be made in the context of numerous Jewish figures who were instrumental in shaping the Beatles' career, which included their manager Brian Epstein and other key personnel. Although the quote has been interpreted in many ways, Lennon himself often chose not to elaborate on its meaning. In order to clarify what Lennon was referring to, let's examine some of the Jewish cast around the Beatles. The following information is sourced from a 2014 article by the Jewish online publication Orthodox Union. It is well known that Brian Epstein, the manager of the Beatles, was Jewish. Epstein's music management company, NEMS, was almost entirely comprised of Jewish businessmen. David Jacobs, who was Epstein's top lawyer, was responsible for negotiating the deals that saw the Beatles' image on merchandise. Pivotal in the launch of the Beatles' popularity were two Jewish New York radio personalities, Murray Kaufman, known as Murray the K, and Bruce Morrow, known as Cousin Brucey. Both were prominent during the band's arrival in New York in 1964. Cousin Brucey, who was born Bruce Meyerowitz, is perhaps New York's most legendary radio personality. During Beatlemania, Bruce was the top DJ on WABC radio, which he nicknamed WA Beatles C. Prior to 1965, no musical performer had attempted to play a concert at an outdoor sports stadium. Sid Bernstein, a Jewish New York impresario, leveraged the Beatles' enormous popularity to arrange their iconic concert at Shea Stadium. Many of the Beatles' most famous publicity photographs were taken by Jewish photographer Dezo Hoffman. Richard Lester, who was also Jewish, was the director charged with the task of bringing the Beatles' first motion picture, A Hard Day's Night, to the big screen. Lester, who was raised by traditional Jewish parents in Philadelphia, would later direct the band's second movie, Help. The producers of these iconic films were Walter Shenson and Bud Orenstein, who were both Jewish. Linda McCartney, the wife of Billy, was also Jewish. Her maiden name was not Eastman. Her father was born Leopold Vail Epstein and later changed his name to Lee Eastman. Her mother, Louise Lindner Eastman, was the daughter of Max Lindner, a major Jewish philanthropist in Cleveland, Ohio. Linda McCartney's three children with Billy, Mary, Stella, and James, are considered Jewish, as is her daughter Heather from her first marriage. Alan Klein, who managed the Beatles from May 1969 until 1973, was Jewish. In October 2011, Billy, a.k.a. Paul McCartney, married his third wife, Nancy Shevell, who was Jewish and a second cousin of Barbara Walters, who was also Jewish. Ringo Starr's stepfather, Harry Graves, was Jewish. It's been rumored that his mother, Elsie Gleaves-Starkey, has Jewish ancestry. Ringo's wife, Barbara Bach, who was originally Barbara Goldbach, is Jewish. In a 2008 LA Times article, Joel Stein, an American journalist, author, and cultural pundit who is Jewish, penned an article that dispels any thoughts that Hollywood is not run by Jews. In the article he states, "As a proud Jew, I want America to know about our accomplishments," and adds, "Yes, we control Hollywood. Without us, you would be flipping between the 700 Club and Davy and Goliath." I realize that for some people this segment of the presentation may be very uncomfortable, but facts are facts. In order to fully comprehend the machine behind the Beatles' rise to fame, this is a necessary aspect of their story that needs to be discussed because it connects to the control system, particularly when it comes to the music and entertainment industries. It is undeniable that the counterculture of the 1960s was an influential time that led to significant changes in the collective psyche. The change was a departure from the traditional values and religions that were prevalent at the time, specifically Christianity. The shift was to transform the mindset of the younger generation towards Crowley's philosophy of, if it feels good, do it. The result was the adoption of new morals and behavior standards that included free love, which encouraged promiscuity, drugs, and the opposition to everything their parents held dear. The Frankfurt School, Tavistock, and the occult underbelly that permeates the control system believe that dismantling the old structures is necessary in order for the phoenix to rise from the ashes. The Beatles played a central role in the culture war waged by the Marxists during the 1960s. One would be hard-pressed to watch any documentary about the Beatles or the 1960s without hearing the phrase, the Beatles were a cultural phenomenon. Thus, the Beatles were designed as a social engineering instrument to restructure and modify the social and cultural landscape of the world. The Beatles laid the groundwork for all pop music genres that follow them. The social scientists replicated the Beatles' template in other genres, each of which was tailored to a distinct or new demographic that needed to be socially engineered. Taylor Swift, with her cult following of Swifties, is a current-day example of the template being employed. She is often compared to the Beatles for her alleged songwriting prowess, as well as her ability to shape and define culture. The plot to subvert America and the rest of the world was rolled out by the London-based Tavistock. This is the reason why the Beatles and bands like the Rolling Stones, the Who, and the Kinks were referred to as the British Invasion. And it's not by accident that the fervor over the Beatles was referred to as Beatlemania. Mania is a psychiatric term, and Tavistock is all about psychiatric manipulation. The characteristics of mania include abnormally elevated moods and increased energy that significantly impair functioning, rapid speech, racing thoughts, distractibility, psychomotor agitation, grandiosity, and impulsivity are some of the key symptoms of a manic state. During the peak of Beatlemania, many first-hand accounts suggest that girls experienced extreme physical reactions during Beatles concerts, including urinating themselves because of overwhelming excitement. Irish singer Bob Geldof, who attended a Beatles concert in the mid-1960s, recalled seeing, quote, rivers of urine running down the aisles. He stated that the stories of teenage girls wetting themselves over John Lennon and Paul McCartney are true. Now let's circle back to the question as to why the McCartney and Beatles conspiracy is important to understand. We'll start with the replacement of Paul McCartney. The replacement of Paul McCartney in late 1966 is important because when he was replaced by Billy Shears, very few people noticed. Yes, there was a segment of the fan base that looked at the Sgt. Pepper album cover and noticed something was off about McCartney. They noted that he looked different, but then again, so did all the other Beatles. Gone were the mop tops and suits. The new look featured the Beatles with longer hair and mustaches dressed in colorful band outfits. What the Controllers did was to change the entire look of the band so that Billy, now playing the role of McCartney, would not stand out. This included placing Billy within the intricate and colorful cover art of the album, which further diverted attention from him as the fan looked at the panacea of psychedelic visuals. Anyone questioning if the guy on the album cover was really Paul McCartney would eventually resolve their intrigue by thinking, who else could it be other than Paul McCartney? It has to be him. No one was thinking in terms of a conspiracy about Paul being replaced. As time passed, the doubters faded away, the questions subsided, and Billy successfully became Paul. This was a significant accomplishment by Tavistock and the band's handlers. They were able to replace one of the most well-known musicians and entertainers in the world with an imposter, and virtually no one noticed. The significance of this achievement from the perspective of the social engineers cannot be overstated. This was a crucial outcome. By successfully swapping out McCartney, they could conceivably replace anyone. From a Tavistock and Deep State perspective, the replacement of Paul McCartney proved to be a resounding success. Another question that many people ask is how and when Paul died. Was it an accident, or was it all pre-planned? Was his death in August of 1966, or was it in September or November? Due to the lack of direct evidence of Paul's death, for example, eyewitness accounts or public records such as a death certificate, it is uncertain how he died. If Paul's death was part of a deep state operation, It's not a difficult task for the operatives to cover up his death and alter government records. Couple that with people around Paul who were hushed up, paid off, or threatened, and the number of voices asking questions decreases significantly. Those who decided to ask questions were branded as crazy and ridiculed. And remember, this was back when the internet and social media did not exist, so the ability to communicate en masse was not available. In Billy's situation, his bloodline and allegiance to secret societies kept everything within the inner circle, which included key players and acts within the music and entertainment industry. As time went by, the risk of exposure decreased dramatically, to the point where the vast majority of people believe Billy is Paul McCartney. If Paul's death was planned, it's possible that it was a ritual sacrifice, and Memoirs implies that this is indeed the case. The book also claims that John and Paul entered into a Faustian bargain in October of 1963. This sacrifice, which the book refers to as, quote, death for success, was done to ensure the band achieved unparalleled fame and influence. The book explains that Paul was the sacrificial lamb or Christ figure who would bring about the new age. This ties back to the cult of Paulism, which I discussed earlier. The parallels to Jesus are not coincidental. Another school of thought among those who examine the McCartney or Paul is dead conspiracy believes that Paul did not die but remained alive after 1966. The premise is that he stepped out for whatever reason, and when he did, Billy took on the role. Regardless of which scenario someone believes, the fact is, Paul was replaced. The evidence is overwhelming that the man who has been playing McCartney for 6 decades is not biological Paul. Some will argue that the evidence is circumstantial, and that is true. But people are convicted of crimes every day in court on the basis of circumstantial evidence. In fact, Billy has been dropping clues since the very beginning and continues to do so, letting us know that he is not Paul. My personal take is that Paul did die on September 11, 1966, and it was likely a ritual sacrifice. Knowing how deeply involved the controllers are in the occult is a major reason why I came to this conclusion. September 11th is a very important date in occult circles, and blood sacrifice, whether animal or human, plays a major role in their rituals. War is an example of blood sacrifice that very few people consider in that context. I know others will disagree and claim he died in late August or November, but my position has always been dead is dead. And for what it's worth, Memoirs states the date was September 11th, 1966. Now that being said, Paul McCartney being replaced, whether because of his death or stepping out of the role, is a subplot to the bigger conspiracy involving the Beatles. The bigger picture has to do with the Beatles being used as a massive psychological operation to socially engineer at a worldwide level. My contention has been that even if Paul were always Paul and Billy never existed, the Beatles would still be a significant and strategic tool for the social engineers. In order to comprehend the deeper conspiracy that surrounds the Beatles, it's important to first examine their early history to see how the stage was set. After completing this section of the presentation, I will conclude by describing why the overall conspiracy is more significant than simply focusing on Paul being replaced. As I have explained in many of my presentations and interviews, the official narrative of the Beatles, which is the classic tale of going from rags to riches, tells a very different story when scrutinized. It's the type of story that everyone loves. 4 working-class young men from Liverpool met Brian Epstein in November of 1961. Epstein, who was running his family's North End music stores in Liverpool, became the band's manager and went on to secure a record contract with EMI Parlophone under the tutelage of George Martin in June of 1962. From that moment on, the Beatles went on to achieve unparalleled fame and became one of the most dominant forces in the history of pop music. Lennon and McCartney were regarded as genius songwriters, the band was characterized as brilliant musicians, and the Beatles were considered by many to be the greatest rock band to have ever existed. The story is well known by Beatle fans in particular. However, once the layers are peeled back, a very different story emerges. The truth is that leading up to their first Hamburg performances in August of 1960, The Beatles were mediocre at best from a musicianship standpoint, and they displayed no songwriting prowess. They were a below-average bar and club band that played cover songs. Their first manager, Alan Williams, recounted in the 1980s documentary The Complete Beatles that he was told not to bring that bum group the Beatles to Hamburg. In an old interview with their first drummer, Pete Best, Pete explained that while in Hamburg, they would play 7 or so hours a night, then depart the club and wake up at 3 p.m. the next day. They needed to be back at the venue by 6 p.m. Thus, the band had a 3-hour time limit to get up, eat, and dress before returning to the club. Their schedule, as well as the temptations of residing in Hamburg's red light district, implies that songwriting was not part of their activities. In Joseph Niesgoda's book, Lennon Prophecy, he explains that the period between their arrival in Hamburg in August of 1960 and their heading back to Liverpool in December of that year, nothing significant transpired for the band. In fact, Lennon and McCartney returned home disappointed. Then, beginning in January of 1961, a band with limited experience and less than a stellar reputation began to schedule gigs regularly. Their gigging was so consistent that it accounted for almost 2/3 of the year. Anyone who would like to confirm this schedule can look up their live performance schedule on Wikipedia. A logical question to ask is, how is it that a band that is not very good and has no track record is consistently booked by bars and clubs? This is the first indication of a possible problem with the narrative. Then in November of 1961, they met Brian Epstein. On January 1st, 1962, 2 months after meeting Epstein, the Beatles were at Decca Records cutting a 15-song demo. The demo consisted of 12 cover songs and 3 original compositions, Like Dreamers Do, Hello Little Girl, and Love of the Loved. None of these songs make it onto any of the Beatles' albums or singles while the band is active. After recording the demo, Decca declined to sign the band. In February of 1962, Brian Epstein played demo tapes for George Martin. After listening to the tapes, Martin tells Brian, "If you want me to judge them based on what you are playing me, I'm sorry. I need to turn you down." In other documented interviews, George Martin went on to say that they didn't impress him, that he thought their music was rubbish, they had nothing behind them, and it was not obvious they were songwriters at the time. At this juncture, Decca and EMI Parlophone refused to sign the Beatles. In March of 1962, even after being rejected by 2 major labels, the Beatles somehow landed a gig with the BBC. A bar and club band that has no track record, plays cover songs, and was rejected by 2 major record labels somehow secured an opportunity to perform at the BBC. The Live at the BBC performances lasted from March of 1962 to May of 1965. It's worth mentioning that the BBC show was not actually live. The songs were pre-recorded with the ability to record multiple takes. If you're recording with takes, then that's not a live performance. At this point, given the Beatles' lack of accomplishments, it certainly appears that there is a significant effort being made behind the scenes to propel the band forward. In June of 1962, George Martin reversed his decision and signed the Beatles to a record contract. The reason for the reversal is unclear, but I suspect it was initiated by either his immediate boss, Len Wood, or the head of EMI, Sir Joseph Lockwood. It's possible that Martin was not previously aware of the Deep State's plans for the band. It's worth noting that George Martin did not work directly with the Beatles after signing them. The job was given to Ron Richards, who later produced the Hollies. According to memoirs, Martin was told to work directly with the band after the Beatles failed to achieve the desired results during rehearsal and recording with Richards. In other words, Martin was informed that delegating the assignment was not an option. In the August-September issue of the music publication Mercy Beat, Ringo was announced as the new drummer for the band, replacing Pete Best. According to the article, the Beatles will travel to London to record with EMI and record songs written for them, which they received from George Martin. Note that the article did not state that the band would record songs written by them. It was clearly stated that they will record songs written for them. The article supports Martin's statements in interviews that Love Me Do was the best song they had to offer at the time, and that's if they actually wrote Love Me Do. George Martin mentioned in other interviews that he was very mindful that Love Me Do was not the big hit he was hoping for and that he had to find songs for the band to perform. It's important to note that in the 1980s documentary The Complete Beatles, Lennon and McCartney were reported to have written over 100 songs between 1956 and 1962, either separately or together. It ends up, perhaps conveniently, that none of the songs were recorded. The question is, where were the 100 songs that John and Paul had supposedly written when they started working with George Martin? It is reasonable to conclude that the songs were either not very good or the story is a complete fabrication. From my perspective, it is the latter. Norman Smith, who was responsible for the Beatles' engineering on their first 6 studio albums, revealed in a 1971 New Music Express interview that he was not impressed with the band when he began working with them. He stated that they were terrible and failed in the studio. He then went on to say that the Beatles talked their way into a recording deal with EMI. In the real world, a band cannot talk its way into a contract. They are either capable of playing and performing, or they are not. If they cannot, then they are shown the door. According to the official narrative, George Martin tried to find songs for them to record, but the Beatles resisted, preferring to record their own compositions, even though there is no evidence they had any songs to record or that they were even songwriters. The notion that these 4 inexperienced band members were going to challenge George Martin, who was not only their producer, but also the head of the Parlophone label, is ridiculous. The Beatles were not in a position to debate with Martin about how he was going to manage and handle them. The reason for taking everyone through the early history of the band, leading up to their EMI contract and George Martin, is to show that the Beatles were not skilled musicians or songwriters. As George Martin explained in interviews, when he met them, they had nothing behind them. Yet, they reached a peak of fame like no other band before or after them. How did that happen? Was the process organic, or were the Beatles manufactured? If it were organic, there would need to be obvious evidence and proof that they had extraordinary musical and songwriting skills, but the cracks in the narrative point in the opposite direction. In 2 interviews from 1966, one on August 5th with the BBC, after the Beatles released their 7th studio album, Revolver, Paul McCartney stated, "We're limited as a group. We're the first to say we're not all that good musically." 2 months prior, in June of 1966, he made a similar comment at a press conference at the Hilton in Japan. Yet, despite their obvious and admitted musical shortcomings, their trajectory from 1962 to 1966 was absolutely spectacular. In the August 5th, 1966 BBC interview, McCartney also said that the only time they need to force themselves to write songs is when an album or film comes up. Forcing themselves to write was an interesting choice of words. He also stated that we, referring to himself and John, don't usually write between albums, maybe 1 or 2 songs. Then we write a great big batch. Because Paul qualified his statement by saying maybe 1 or 2, the word maybe can also imply that no songwriting took place between their album releases. Whether the number of songs allegedly written between albums is 1, 2, or even 0, Paul's statement is completely in contradiction with the official narrative, which states that the Beatles were a constant songwriting machine. We're told they wrote in the studio, while they were touring, on film sets, and during their holidays and vacations. However, during the BBC interview, Paul revealed that the official narrative regarding when they supposedly wrote their music is not true. How can they be writing all the time if, according to McCartney, they wrote in great big batches? Even the BBC interviewer had a hard time believing that they could write 12 or more songs in such a short amount of time. The interviewer's perplexity was reinforced when John and Paul explained that with their last album, Revolver, it took weeks to write just 1 song. So which is it? Is it a multi-week process to write 1 song, or a multi-week process to write a dozen songs? Also, during the interview, Paul discusses the song Yesterday and said, "We didn't have to show ourselves up again in the studio." According to my British listeners, The phrase "we didn't have to show ourselves up" is an expression used by someone who wants to avoid embarrassment. In the U.S., the comment would be interpreted as not being present or not attending the recording session. Either way, Paul is stating that, except for his vocal, he was not on the recording of yesterday, even though he is credited with playing the acoustic guitar on the track. The big batch writing approach is the story behind the Rubber Soul album, which, when I analyzed it, was filled with gaps and is extremely problematic for the official narrative. There are two fundamental problems with the making of Rubber Soul. The first problem with the story is the feasibility of writing, learning, rehearsing, arranging, and recording 13 to 16 new songs in 30 days, which is highly unlikely. I would suggest that it is actually impossible. The second issue is the cycle time to manufacture the record, which includes creating record labels, album art, sleeve design, printing, packaging, and distribution. A process that back in the day required 6 to 8 weeks or longer once the final acetate or lacquer was created, but took only 2.5 weeks for Rubber Soul. This shortened cycle time meant that the process of manufacturing record labels and record sleeves was already underway before the Beatles entered the studio. This was made possible because the songs for Rubber Soul were pre-written by outside songwriters and the instrumental tracks were pre-recorded by studio musicians. With the songs written and pre-recorded, the song titles and run times were already known well in advance of the Beatles' arrival at EMI on October 11th of 1965. Knowing the song titles and run times allowed George Martin to finalize the song sequencing. With the song titles, run times, and sequencing completed, the printing process could commence with enough lead time to ensure that Rubber Soul is available in retail stores by December 3rd. The missing link in the process was the recording of the vocals, and that is what the Beatles were in the studio to do. After the vocals were finished, George Martin mixed the vocal tracks with the pre-recorded instrumental tracks to complete the songs. Now let's dig deeper into some of the problematic aspects of the official narrative to understand why the process had to begin well in advance of the Beatles arriving at the studio. Recording for the Rubber Soul sessions began on October 12, 1965, and ended late in the evening on November 11th. To be more precise, we were told that the November 11th session ran for 13 hours, starting at 6 p.m. and ending at 7 a.m. on the morning of November 12th. According to the narrative, 4 songs still needed to be finished on November 11th, which is the final day of recording. The story becomes more implausible because 2 songs, Girl and You Won't See Me, have yet to be written. The task of writing 2 songs from scratch, learning them, rehearsing them, and recording them in 13 hours is not even close to reality. And keep in mind that Paul stated that they, meaning the band, were not very good musically, which further complicates the story. If this was not challenging enough, 2 other songs need to be completed. Those 2 songs were I'm Looking Through You and Wait. Even though Wait was pulled in from the help sessions, it still required overdubbing. To summarize, the account we are given about what happened on November 11th, the final day of recording, is highly questionable. According to the narrative, recording concludes, additional mixing takes place, and George Martin completes the song sequencing on November 16th, one day before the lacquer is finalized on November 17th. Once the sequencing is finished and the lacquer is finalized, the printing process for the center labels and album sleeves can begin. This process requires a lead time of 6 to 8 weeks, with 6 weeks representing an expedited process. 6 weeks out from when the lacquer was finalized on November 17th means that the labels and sleeves will not be ready until late December after Christmas. If the process is 8 weeks, the labels and sleeves won't be available until mid-January. Remember, EMI needs the album in retail by December 3rd for the Christmas buying season, so late December or mid-January was not an option. It's important to understand that the center labels on vinyl records are affixed to the vinyl during pressing, not afterward. Once the vinyl is pressed, the album is inserted into the record sleeves. This means if the pressing of Rubber Soul began on November 17th, or at the latest, November 18th, the final center labels with the sequence song titles, as well as the record sleeves, must be at the plant when pressing begins. This is because the process of pressing the records cannot proceed without the final center labels or sleeves, especially the labels, which are adhered to the record at the same time as the vinyl is pressed. With an 8-week cycle time, the process to design, approve, proof, print, and deliver the labels and sleeves would have had to begin on or around October 8th, 4 days before the Beatles started recording. An expedited process of 6 weeks means that the process had to begin on or around October 22nd. By October 21st, the Beatles had the basic rhythm tracks recorded for 3 songs, Run for Your Life, Drive My Car, and Day Tripper, with 2 other songs being worked on. That means 11 songs were still in the ether. I also calculated a 4-week cycle time, which shows that the process needs to begin no later than November 5th, at which time the Beatles still had 6 of the 16 songs to nail down. In any of the cases, it's clear that the song titles and run times were known beforehand, which allowed the sequencing process to be completed and the manufacturing process for the labels and sleeves to begin. According to the official story, within 24 hours of song sequencing, EMI was able to print thousands of finalized center labels and record sleeves that contained the titles of the songs in sequenced order. This remarkable feat enabled Rubber Soul to arrive in retail stores by December 3rd of 1965. A process that was supposed to take 6 to 8 weeks was magically reduced to 17 days from the time we were told the sequencing was completed on November 16th. So the question is, how was EMI able to get Rubber Soul into stores by December 3rd? The answer is, all the heavy lifting was done before the Beatles stepped foot in the studio. Since the songs for Rubber Soul were pre-written and recorded in advance, George Martin had everything he needed with ample lead time to get the printing process underway. The only thing missing were the vocal tracks, and that is what the Beatles did during the 30 days. They sang. George Martin then mixed the final vocal tracks with the instrumentals to complete the songs. With the labels and sleeves already at the plant, pressing could begin. It was this process that enabled the initial batch of records to be in retail outlets by December 3rd. I believe that this was the technique employed to record the Beatles' first 7 UK studio albums between 1962 and 1966, covering Please Please Me to Revolver. Starting with Sgt. Pepper, and in particular on the White Album, I believe that the Beatles, especially John and George, wrote more of their own material and played on more of the recorded tracks. However, I highly suspect that outside songwriters and studio musicians were still being utilized during the period of 1967 through 1970. You'll notice that I excluded Billy from the, quote, writing and playing more scenario because I believe that he was always writing and playing on Beatle tracks, perhaps even before 1967. For example, his claim to have written the music to In My Life in 1965 is a possible clue that he was involved in the Beatles' music prior to 1967. In terms of operations management, I think it's highly probable that Theodore Adorno from the Frankfurt School was a significant stakeholder working alongside George Martin, who was the managing director. I also think it's likely that both Adorno and Martin contributed to the songwriting, along with a half-dozen talented songwriters from the Tavistock EMI staff, especially during the 1962 through 1966 period. I also think it's possible that Phil Spector, working with Martin, participated in the recording and production of the music beyond his work on the Beatles' Let It Be album. My suspicion is based on a hard-to-find interview Spector did with Roy Carr in 1976 for Ram magazine. In that interview, Spector claimed that his involvement with the Beatles was not limited to the Let It Be album, but went back to the very beginning. Spector's association with the LA-based Wrecking Crew, who were the go-to studio musicians hired to record pop music in the 1960s and 70s, makes his claim intriguing at the very least. Another question that comes up often is who do I think were some of the studio musicians playing on Beatles recordings? Apart from Andy White, Eric Clapton, Billy Preston, and Nicky Hopkins, who are acknowledged for playing on Beatle tracks, other possible studio players on Beatle recordings include Bernard Purdie, Ronnie Verrill, Hal Blaine, Ginger Baker, Donovan, Jimmy Page, Vic Flick, Big Jim Sullivan, Herbie Flowers, Jack Bruce, Jim Keltner, Glenn Campbell, and Alan White. I have no doubt there are other names I haven't identified, but these are the musicians I think played on Beatles songs. I should also add that it is very possible that Andy White, Billy Preston, Eric Clapton, and Nicky Hopkins played on more tracks than what the mainstream sources acknowledge. For example, I think it's highly probable that George Martin hired Andy White to drum on most, if not all, of the Please Please Me album. In my opinion, Rubber Soul is the silver bullet proving that the Beatles did not write all their own music or play on all their recorded tracks. If you're interested in learning more about my research on the Beatles' music, please refer to the links in the description box below. We can see that even the Beatles themselves, as illustrated in the August 5, 1966 BBC interview, were telling a different story than that of the official narrative. The question becomes, who do we believe? Do we trust the storytellers from the media or the two men who are supposedly the band's legendary songwriters? The funny thing is that both stories are not credible. The Beatles, in particular Lennon and McCartney, were not writing songs every waking moment of their lives, and they weren't writing a dozen or more songs on demand. The songs, especially during the early period of 1962 through 1966, were written behind the scenes by ghostwriters while the Beatles were traveling around the world playing their roles. I believe Paul's comment about writing in, quote, great big batches was actually in reference to the band having to learn the vocals for the songs that were selected for a particular album. The Beatles were not a group of superhuman musical geniuses. The band consisted of 4 young men who were groomed and schooled to play their defined roles in a deep state operation that targeted the masses, specifically the younger generation, to be socially engineered. The question of how much knowledge the Beatles had about what they were involved in is a good one. I seriously doubt that they were aware of the deeper end-to-end aspects of the operation. Only a small number of people had that level of knowledge. Everyone else involved, including the Beatles, were in a compartmentalized capacity and played their part accordingly. That being said, suffice to say that the Beatles knew they were not writing all their songs or playing on all of their recorded tracks, especially between 1962 and 1966. From that point of view, they had to know that they were active participants in a massive deception. My research has shown that the official narrative around the Beatles, which describes the band as consisting of 4 magical musicians who brought us the brilliant songwriting duo of Lennon and McCartney, is a myth. In fact, in an interview with Rolling Stone magazine in December of 1970, John Lennon referred to the Beatles, Paul McCartney, and Bob Dylan as myths. Tavistock and other control mechanisms, such as the mass media and the music and entertainment industry, were responsible for manufacturing their rise to stardom. Without the deep state machine behind them, the Beatles would have faded away before they even started. What Tavistock did was to recruit 4 young men who were likely on their radar from early on to undergo grooming and training for their assigned roles. How early in life they were identified is, of course, speculative. I suspect they were already in a deep state program by the time they arrived in Hamburg in August of 1960. John Lennon was 17 when his mother Julia passed away. According to mainstream sources, his mother's death had a profound effect on him, resulting in a period of heavy drinking, frequent fights, and rage. His father, Freddie, was absent from his life, so he was raised by his Aunt Mimi. Paul McCartney's mother, Mary, passed away when he was 14. Information regarding his father, Jim McCartney, is scarce. Apart from being a musician, Jim also worked as a salesman for a cotton merchant, and in another job, he operated a lathe machine. On Paul McCartney's Wikipedia page, there is no link for Jim McCartney to help us learn more about him. I find the lack of information regarding McCartney's parents strange, given his level of fame. What is also odd is that Paul McCartney did not attend Jim's funeral in 1976. What compelling reason would there be for not attending a parent's funeral? The story goes that McCartney, who was about to tour, was advised by his stepmother not to attend the funeral to avoid the chaos of his presence. It seems to me that he could have rescheduled the start of the tour and discreetly paid his respects without causing any disturbance. Perhaps Paul McCartney failed to attend his father's funeral because he's not Paul and Jim was not his father. The Beatles' constant gigging between January 1961 and their arrival in the United States on February 7, 1964, served as a form of boot camp. The band underwent a rigorous training process to prepare them for taking Beatlemania worldwide. This involved teaching the band how to play the songs they were to perform on the world stage. Some of those performances were live, others had the band miming to a backing track, and other times the performances were enhanced post-production. This was the case with their performance at Shea Stadium. According to Brian Epstein in the October 1965 edition of Beatles' book, their vocals needed to be re-recorded in the studio before releasing the concert footage. The overdubbing was necessary due to the noise bleed from the screaming audience and the vocals being sung through the stadium's PA system, resulting in poor playback quality. If the noise level of the crowd was affecting the vocals, then any other instrument on stage, such as guitars, bass, and drums, were also affected. The vast majority of fans don't know how post-production editing is utilized to package a band's image. The illusion must have both visual and audio appeal because the band or artist is being sold as a product, and the Beatles were no exception. An example of fixing live performances after the fact can be illustrated with Thin Lizzy's 1977 live album, Live and Dangerous. According to their producer Tony Visconti, 75% of the album was recorded in the studio, with only the drums and audience noise remaining from the original live recordings. Visconti said that overdubbing and production were essential in order for the listener to hear a professional-sounding band. Several big-name rock bands have been accused of using backing tracks during live performances, with some accusations stemming from video evidence or public statements. Bands such as Kiss, Motley Crue, Shinedown, Wasp, Aerosmith, and Santa Cruz have been specifically named in these allegations. Other acts like Fozzy and Black Sabbath have also been linked to the practice. The Beatles were created as a result of a deep-state strategy to influence the masses to adopt a different set of values and beliefs. The creation of the Beatles as a massive psychological operation illustrates the extent to which the control system will go to socially engineer the population to achieve its end-state objectives. As previously mentioned, the Beatles were a cultural phenomenon by any measure. Their impact on society's beliefs, values, and behavior is highly significant. Their influence is still present in the minds of millions of fans today. The Beatles were marketed as something new and significant, particularly among young people who subscribe to the counterculture mindset of free love, drugs, and opposition to anything considered oppressive, whether real or imagined. The Beatles were the Pied Pipers of the cult of Pan. They laid the foundation for other bands and artists to follow and build upon. A cult is typically characterized as a group with excessive devotion to a person, idea, object, or belief system, often with a charismatic leader at its center. Many Beatle fans, particularly those who are devoted followers, exhibit cult-like behavior. The bond between the band is so strong that even though the group broke up 55 years ago, millions of fans across the world continue to idolize and worship them in a godlike manner. The argument I hear over and over is that the music is great, so how can that be a bad thing? I agree that the music is great, but it is music with an agenda. One of the unfortunate downsides of the Beatles' narrative is the psychological programming has conditioned the minds of superior musicians and songwriters to believe that their talent and skills will always be inferior to the brilliance of the Fab Four. This is a clear indication of the programming's effectiveness, particularly in its impact on the minds of many musicians and songwriters. Social scientists have perfected the art of knowing which buttons to press to direct individuals toward the ultimate goal of the control system, and they do it in a very subtle, methodical, and incremental way. To believe that the Beatles achieved their accomplishments organically or by escaping the control system is naive. Nothing as significant as the Beatles comes about naturally. The direction of society and culture is fundamentally altered by the manufacturing and implementation of significant events and movements. The deep state created the Beatles to carry out an agenda that was based on Marxist ideology. The Beatles were not just a band, they were and still are a Marxist zeitgeist. Now to answer the question why the Beatles conspiracy is important. The conspiracy is significant because it includes all the elements of how the control system manipulates the masses. To start with, it illustrates how the power of music, a form of media that conveys emotions, ideas, and values, can be used as a powerful tool to indoctrinate a population with new morals, beliefs, and lifestyles. It reveals the power of creating cults of personality in the form of Pied Pipers to guide the masses. It provides insight into the psychological techniques used in mass manipulation, as well as the ideologies and tactics of the controllers, which are based in Marxism. It helps us identify the people and groups who form the deep state, such as the Frankfurt School in Tavistock, as well as the connections to aristocratic bloodlines and secret societies. It demonstrates how the principles of the occult and the theologies of the cult of Pan, the Lema, the Kabbalah, Luciferianism, and Satanism are woven into world events and movements. The Beatles conspiracy serves as a model for decoding other conspiracies since it encompasses many of the tools used to social engineer and brainwash. Understanding the players, motives, and mechanisms used by the deep state to manipulate our minds can help us decode and recognize other efforts by the control system to deceive and reshape humanity. Knowing who your enemy is and how they operate is essential for defeating them. Since 2016, when I began researching the Beatles' unofficial narrative, followers of my research have stated that this conspiracy was their red pill. The conspiracy broke down the wall of illusion and pulled back the curtain to expose the great odds working behind the scenes. It opened a door that made people aware that there are no sacred cows, and we should question everything that has been fed to us by this artificial construct known as pop culture. George Harrison said it well when he told us, "If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there." Thanks for listening.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Billy Watson TV. Today it gives me great pleasure to have my good friend Mike Williams back on the show. He is well known for his alternative Beatles research, which we'll no doubt touch on, but he is also well versed in how the world is controlled, and will delve into the mechanics of that in our chat. Thanks for joining us, and welcome back to the show, Mike. Good to have you back on Billy Watson TV.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Billy Watson TV. It's my second interview of the day, so I've just recovered from interviewing Mark Nevin, which was really interesting. You can check that out on my website later. And I'm delighted to have Mike Williams, an old friend on, Mr. Sage of Quay, and he's done lots of Beatles research and into the whole workings of the world. So welcome back to the show, Mike. Long time no chat.
Thank you, Billy. Thank you for having me back, and that was a great intro.
Had a wee bit of a Turkish flavour, that one, because as you know, we're about to do an interview, and as I told you, a neighbour tried to cut off his ex-partner's internet supply. Another block failed to do that, but cut our block off, so that interview got postponed until I'd been to Turkey for 4 weeks, so I'm back from that. It was really good break. Nice to actually, just walk away from the computer. And although I still obviously had internet there, but, work in front of it every day and just change things up and de-stress quite a bit. You don't realise, again, how much stress and bullshit you carry around with you.
Oh, yeah.
You can get a period to just kind of unwind and enjoy the sun, which we never, ever do here. So that was nice. How's things with you?
Good. Just to let the audience know, you might see him in the background there. That's my dog, Charlie. He's an Akita Chow mix. He's 14 and a half years old. And he's doing okay, but he has his moments every once in a while. So I just want to give you a heads up that I'm sure nothing will happen, but it's possible I may have to attend to him. He has been having these periodic seizures. They're minor. They're very minor. But he is 14 and a half. And like I said, he's doing okay. But just in case, to give everybody a heads up, I may have to look after him if something happens.
Of course, family, and I'm sure the dog's part of the
he's
family.
my best bud.
Yeah. I've never really seen him. Obviously, I've left the door open there. Normally that door's shut, but
Yeah.
I guess that's the reason why.
Yeah, he just walked in. He's still standing there.
Yeah. So you've had them for quite a while. 14 and a half that's the thing about pets. You get really attached to them, but obviously you know they're going to die probably before you do. But
Well, his breed, Akita Chow mix, both breeds, whether it's a Chow or an Akita, their average lifespan is 10 to 12 years.
all right.
So Charlie's at 14 and a half now, and he's been remarkable. He's just a really, really good dog. And when you think about it, Billy, almost 15 years. It'll be 15 years next May. And so I'll be 67. So he's been in my life since I was 52 years old.
Yeah, quite well, obviously.
It's a long time, you know. So, and I've been looking after him and caring for him. And, you know, that's been a lot of the reason why I have been not as active with YouTube and stuff like that, is because I have other responsibilities family-wise that I have to look after. One, of course, is Charlie, and my mom is 90 years old.
All right.
Yeah. So, you know, there are things that are more important than what people think are important on social media.
This is part of the reason I think you kind of took a wee back step from the Beatles stuff, because you need other life.
Yeah.
To make room for that normal life.
Yeah. The Beatles stuff, we talked about this. I did it for 8 years of just going at it. And then you get to a point where it's diminishing returns. I'm not going to talk about it for the sake of talking about it. I just recently uploaded a video, but that video, the whole concept, has been on the back burner for over a year. And I had a file set aside, and I had some files on my hard drive. And the intent was, going back, it was like 15 months ago or so, was to take my research and see if I can kind of squash it into a 1 hour or so presentation to hit all the key points. It wasn't going to be super in-depth, because that would be hours and hours of presentation. But what I finally decided, let me finish that. And I did. And I uploaded it on, to my Paul is Dead channel on October 8th, and my other channels on Lennon's birthday, October 9th. So that's really the first presentation that I have uploaded in over a year. Everything else has been interviews. People would interview me. That's different than me actually putting presentations together, or have the replay double headers, which my new subscribers love because it gets them ramped up quickly on the conspiracy. But so I did forewarn my listeners that with the recent video, it's called Frankfurt, Tavistock, Marxism, and the Beatles. I highly recommend watching it because it ties in the whole Marxist connection point. With that video, I up front, my splash screen said, "This is not my re-entry into the research. It's just something that was, like I said, sitting on the back burner, and I felt, okay, let's just get it out."
Yeah, I've just been watching that. I've got about 3/4 of the way through it, and it is quite a good synopsis. As you say, it hits the main points, and it takes people through a lot of stuff quite quickly, which some of your other ones, you have to be kind of dedicated.
Yeah.
To want to get through maybe 4 hours of Rubber Soul in-depth analysis.
Yeah. That was part of the problem, because people have short attention spans, so they want something that's quick and easy that they can watch and take in. Most people. There are people that will take the time to go back in time, take a look at what you've done before, and then build upon that. But most people, they just want down and dirty, quick and easy.
Yeah, when we arranged the chat the first time, you said there was a few things that you wanted to touch on. I'm not sure if you picked up on these in the presentation, but I'll just
yeah. Oh yeah, I forgot all about that.
I'll just remind you of what you wrote.
Oh, what were they? There were 3 things that people.
Number 1 was the Beatles didn't write any of their music. Basically, you're saying 3 things that people say you said about the Beatles but never did.
That's right. Yeah. I'm glad
one, the Beatles didn't write any of their music.
Yeah, right. I'm glad you kept the email because I completely forgot about those 3 questions. Right. So every once in a while when I'm perusing and I see people talking about the Beatles or there's videos, it's interesting. I'm seeing more videos now where, and people who are talking about the Beatles conspiracy and, Paul is dead. And they're talking about it as if um, they have come to their own revelations and stuff like that. And I can clearly see that they have lifted a lot of their material from me.
Yeah.
There was one person, I'm not going to say who it is or the channel, but it was kind of funny. This guy's going on about the memoirs of Billy Shears, which I've been talking about since 2016. And he's presenting. And as he's presenting some of my slides.
Oh my God. People have no shame. People have literally no shame these days. It's off the scale. Like, again, my partner, she was making TikTok videos, and then people just lift the whole video and claim it's theirs, and, lift the audio from it and stick a different visual on and don't give any credit in that. They just don't care.
No, I know. It's really bad form and it's unprofessional. So if you're doing that, be upfront about it. Give credit where credit is due. I mean, I do that. If people send me stuff, and when I post it onto my community page, I will say thank you, Billy, or thank you, Jim, or thank you, Sally, for forwarding me the information and allowing me to share it to my audience. So even when I do my presentations, if I received information from somebody else, I really put the effort in to make sure that I acknowledge that this is not mine. This came from that person. I mean, obvious examples would be the work that Sally has done on Billy Shears and his eye. Also, Stacy's work on his bloodlines, and so on. I mean, there's a number of examples I could give. So you have to do that. You have to give credit where credit is due. Okay, so getting back to the question, yeah. So what I see a lot is Mike says that the Beatles didn't write any of their music, and they didn't play on any of their recorded tracks. In other words, what they're saying is Mike is saying that the Beatles wrote zero music and played on zero tracks, and I never, ever said that. I never, ever said that. That's why when I did the big presentation, did the Beatles write all their own music, going back to April of 2020, that's why I used the word all. I didn't say the Beatles didn't write any of their music. Did the Beatles write all of their own music? And what's implied in that is that they did write some of the music, and they did play on some of the tracks. It's just not all of the music and all of the tracks. And so every once in a while, I just have to step up and make the case again, because it's unbelievable to me how people, I don't know, I think it's either intentional, right? They want to misconstrue the research because they don't like the message that you're bringing, or they just are not very good at comprehending. That's the only two scenarios that I can come up with. So to make it clear, I never said the Beatles didn't write any music and they didn't play on any tracks. I did say, and I still hold to this, that between 1962 and 1966, I don't think they wrote anything. And I don't think that they played on any of those tracks. And if they did play on some of those tracks, maybe it was small parts of the song. But I mean, the basic rhythm tracks, like a tambourine, right? Or something like that. But the basic rhythm tracks, when we're talking about guitar playing, bass, keyboards, drums, from 62 to 66, I seriously doubt they were on those tracks. But then starting in 1967 with the release of Sgt. Pepper, things changed up, because at that point, Billy had control of the band. It was no longer really George Martin handling them. And Billy had a different approach. His approach was to get them more involved with the actual songwriting and playing on the tracks. Although, even then, between 67 and 70, they did not play on all of those songs, all of those tracks, and they didn't write all of those songs. But they did write some of them. And when I say they, I'm specifically talking about John Lennon and George Harrison, and forget about Ringo. I mean, I just, every once in a while, he would allegedly come up with something. I don't put Billy in that category because Billy's been writing and playing for a very long time.
I think Billy, again, I've watched your research quite a lot, but he was actually involved with the Beatles before he became Paul McCartney, and obviously Sgt. Pepper is mainly his work, I think.
Yeah. He had to have been working and recording and writing for the Beatles before 1967, in my opinion, because, well, first of all, there's that whole story where he came out a number of years ago and said he wrote the music to the song "In My Life," which is supposedly 100% a John Lennon song, right? Although some people will say that Billy or Paul McCartney did some part of it or whatever, but essentially it's a John Lennon song from beginning to end. And but Billy said he wrote the music, and that was in 1965. And so the mainstream media went into damage control, and they had to say, well, our computer models from 2 universities prove that he misremembered writing "In My Life," and the song is a John Lennon song. Well, you and I have talked about this before, and I spoke about this on other shows. You don't misremember writing a song like "In My Life," which is one of the most famous rock pop songs of all time. If you take a look at any of the rock polls of the greatest songs of all time, "In My Life" is almost always in the top 10, almost always. And you don't misremember writing a song like that. That would be like somebody telling me that I misremembered writing a song that I wrote. No, I remember writing all of my songs because they were my songs and I wrote them.
Seems like he wants the credit for it, basically.
Yeah. So, that's exactly where Billy's at in his life right now. He wants to have as much acknowledgement as possible for what he really was, versus being known for being a guy that died back in 1966. So everything he's done since 66 is credited to a guy that's no longer with us. And you get to a point in your life. He was born in 1937, and he's 5 years older than Paul, so he's 88 now.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, so he's looking for his due. Anyway, what was the second question? So we clarified that one. I never said that the Beatles didn't write any music or did not play on any tracks. Never said it.
But then, just to go on, obviously the White Album, and they went to India and stuff like that, and Dear Prudence, and there was kind of a mixed bag. You can imagine them getting involved in a few bits and pieces there.
Yeah, I mean, you could tell the tracks where they're playing on because the skill level and the articulation or the crispness of the playing is not what it was when you go back to the 62 to 66 period. So when you listen to the guitar playing and the drumming back during the early period, it shifts up drastically in the later period. Now, let me pick a song as an example. Piggies on the White Album. Now we listen to Piggies. It's this Baroque orchestral piece, and it's all Theodore Adorno. It has Adorno written all over it, both musically and from a philosophy perspective, the lyrics. So that song is credited to George Harrison. We're told that George wrote that song. But then go listen to the song Long, Long, Long on the White Album, which is long, long, long. I mean, I really don't like that song. It just drags on, but I'm not going to pick on the song. That, I believe, it's very possible that George Harrison wrote that song. I mean, it's not a very complex song. The lyrics aren't, spectacular, but it's very possible he wrote that. So we have the comparison between Long, Long, Long and Piggies. And stylistically, from a song structure perspective, they are 2 very, very different songs. They clearly came from 2 different sources. The same person did not write both those songs. And if you listen to the drumming, a lot of the drumming on the White Album, let's actually go back to Sgt. Pepper. Listen to the drumming on With a Little Help from My Friends. That sounds like Ringo because it's very clunky. It's boom, 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 boom. He just wasn't very fluid behind the drum kit. And if we go back to Day Tripper, listen to the drum roll at the beginning of Day Tripper. When have we ever heard Ringo do that again? Like never? So we have those types of situations. And so between 67 and 70, it is a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag between them writing the songs and versus ghostwriters, and then playing on the tracks versus studio musicians. And in the video I just uploaded, Billy, I rattled off a bunch of names of studio players that I believe played on Beatle tracks. Now, it is 4 musicians that we know for sure because the official narrative admits to it. So Andy White, who George Martin hired back in 1962 to drum on 2 tracks. Actually, I think he drummed on a 3rd track too.
I mean, if Ringo was that good, then why didn't they use him? They brought him into the band. Surely he should have been able to do that. And it wasn't like "Love Me Do" and quite simple songs, really.
Yeah, I mean, when the Beatles got signed and the band was signed, there should have been no mystery as to what the skill level and proficiency was of their playing abilities and recording in the studio. It's not. It shouldn't. In fact, it's not a mystery. George Martin knew exactly what he had, and he knew that what he had was he didn't have studio quality players.
Yeah.
Plain and simple. And he didn't have songwriters. But, that's a story that I've talked about a lot of times. So you have Andy White, and then you have Eric Clapton, who played on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. You have Billy Preston, who played on the Get Back sessions. And a lot of people don't know this one. Nicky Hopkins, the great keyboard player on Nicky's past, he played the keyboards on Revolution, the song Revolution.
Right.
So those are 4 right there. And in the presentation, I said that I seriously doubt that those 4 guys only played on those songs that the official narrative admits to. So I think that Andy White probably drummed on most, if not all, of the first album, Please Please Me. Eric Clapton, as far as I'm concerned, was probably on many tracks other than While My Guitar Gently Weeps. I think it's his lead guitar playing on another George Harrison song, Old Brown Shoe. That sounds like Eric to me. Nicky Hopkins and Billy Preston with their keyboard work, piano work, God only knows how many songs they were playing on with Billy, because Billy's also a very good piano player. But other musicians, Bernard Purdy, because Bernard is admitted to drumming on 21 tracks. Ronnie Verrill, another drummer. Ronnie's family, a family member, wrote to me after April of 2020 and said to me that their relative, Ronnie's been gone now, passed away for a long time. I think he died back in 2012 or so. He drummed on Beatle tracks. He was also the drummer for the Muppet Animal. So Animal used to drum, right? Yeah. That was Ronnie that was doing the drumming for Animal. Let me see, Hal Blaine, Big Jim Sullivan, Vic Flick, Jimmy Page, a person that I know was very good friends with Dan Peake. Dan was one of the founding members of the band America, and he knew, this person that I know knew Dan very, very well. And Dan told him that Jimmy Page played the lead guitar on I Saw Her Standing There.
Right.
Also, I was told by another source that Alan White, who was known for as the drummer for the band Yes, he played on Beatle tracks. Jim Keltner, the studio musician, drummer, drummed on Beatle tracks as well. And the reason why I say that is because I was watching a video and I forgot, it was one of the Wrecking Crew guitarists, I believe. And he was saying that, of course, Phil Spector was tied into the Wrecking Crew. That was his house band, right? And when they were recording, Jim Keltner was drumming, and Phil Spector kept referring to him as Ringo the whole time.
Right.
And so it got so awkward for Jim Keltner that the way the story goes is that when the session was over, and the thing was, the reason why it was a problem was because there were journalists there.
Right.
Okay. And Phil kept calling him Ringo.
Kind of an in-joke kind of thing.
Yeah. And he would do it over the PA.
Right.
So hey, Ringo, can you do this, And so what happened was it got so awkward for Jim that the way the story goes is that he left through the back door. Like he would not go through the main entrance because he didn't want to have to answer any questions, possible questions from journalists who would say, why was he calling you Ringo?
Yeah.
Well, the reason why he was calling him Ringo is because Keltner was, in all likelihood, one of the drummers on Beatle tracks. So, and there are other musicians I probably forgot.
Plus, the Phil Spector thing, though, he was all involved with the Beatles as well.
Yeah,
He was there when they arrived to America and stuff like that.
Yeah, so there was a interview that Phil did back in 1976 with Roy Carr. Roy Carr was he worked for New Music Express, and I think he was the editor at one time. And I don't know whether he was the editor in 1976, but he was interviewing Phil in 76 for a magazine called Ram Magazine, which was a music magazine. And in that interview, Phil was saying that he played a huge part in the Beatles, in their success and their fame. In fact, I think one of the quotes, I'm going to paraphrase it, was that he made them who they were. And as I read that, I was thinking, well, what does he mean by that? So in the interview, he claims that George Martin was predominantly the arranger, but which would mean that Phil was responsible for having the songs recorded. So
I think this is done like sending the tapes transatlantic kind of thing.
Yeah, well, Bernard Purdy talks about that. So let me just finish up on Phil. So Phil's connection to the Wrecking Crew, and him saying in that interview that his connection and his working with the Beatles goes back to day one. And he said to Roy Carr, when the Beatles landed in America on February 7th of 1964, was I not on that plane? And Roy Carr said, yes, you were. And Phil was like, okay, there you go. And then he rattled off a couple of the albums that he was involved in. I think Rubber Soul was one of them, Sgt. Pepper. But basically Phil was saying, hey, all of them. Going back to Please Please Me, I was involved. Why is that not far-fetched? Going back to the Wrecking Crew. So it says to me that I'm not saying all of the Beatles songs were recorded by the Wrecking Crew or members of the Wrecking Crew, but it's very possible, it's very feasible that that is indeed what happened. And of course, in the UK, they had their own version of the Wrecking Crew and session players that would play on these songs. I mean, we had Eric Clapton, and we had Jimmy Page, and we had Herbie Flowers. This Ginger Baker, exactly. And so we had both sides of the pond, I believe, played a part in getting these songs recorded. And so that's why I don't discount it. People want to just say, oh, you can't believe Phil Spector because he wound up killing somebody and he went to jail. But okay, yeah, Phil was crazy. Okay, there's no doubt about it. You watch any documentary, he had a love for guns, and he was a very strange, peculiar guy. But that doesn't take away from what he was as far as the music industry goes.
Well, he's produced lots of artists, the Ramones, and even John Lennon's Imagine album. So
yes, he did a lot of work with the Beatles, George Harrison and John Lennon, post the Beatles breakup.
Yeah,
and
so
of course he was
there,
and he was involved in Let It Be. And I mean, John Lennon said that because a lot of people like to crap on Let It Be and say that it wasn't their greatest effort and all of that, and they want to blame Phil Spector for that. But when Lennon was asked about it, he said, look, we handed Phil the biggest pile of shit from a recording perspective that you could imagine. And he did something with it. And I think he did a great job. This is what John Lennon said. Mm. So, and the story goes that the Beatles walked away from the Let It Be sessions or the Get Back sessions. And in fact, before Phil Spector was called in or asked to patch it all up and make something of it. Glenn Johns, who was the sound engineer during the Get Back sessions, the story goes that Billy and Lennon had originally gave him the tapes to make something of them and to put an album together. And that became a bootleg known as the Get Back sessions, or I think it was Get Back, but it was never officially released. The official release came when Phil Spector got involved and started putting it together. In fact, the song I Me Mine, that is a George Harrison song, that song I think Harrison had about 1 minute of the song, if I recall the story correctly. And it was Phil Spector who sat down and edited and started to copy and paste to get the song to the, whatever it is now, 2.5 to 3 minutes. So it was a lot of stuff like that was going on behind the scenes. And so my personal view is I believe Phil Spector. I do. I believe that in that interview that he did with Roy Carr for Ram Magazine in '76 was very, very revealing. And, you could chalk it up.
You've got that stuff inside you. It's hard to keep it in all these years, especially journalists are asking you questions and stuff.
Yeah, Phil was asked about that. He tried to play it off and say, well, it really doesn't matter who gets the credit publicly. It's about knowing, what you did personally. But, we know that that's just something that people say. Yeah. If Phil was involved in all this, think about it. He was completely pushed out of the equation because when they talked about the Beatles and from a production perspective, it always came down to George Martin, or it would come down to George Martin and Norman Smith, the engineer for the first 6 albums, or George Martin and Jeff Emmerich. And where was Phil? So after a while, you think to yourself, if you're Phil, okay, you know what? I'm going to see if I can spill the beans a little bit and push some stuff out there to see if I can get acknowledgement for what my real contribution was. So it's a very interesting story. And I talk about that in the recent presentation I just put up.
I think it's like, Billy Shears these days, whatever, he's probably signed some secrets agreement that he can't reveal at all, but they'll let it slip in certain ways so that those reading between the lines with the back knowledge can pick it up,
Yeah, that's exactly what's going on. They will put stuff out and you have to read between the lines. See, they know that the vast majority of the fan base is completely brainwashed.
Hardcore.
And they just love the Cinderella story and they love to worship, and that's what they're going to grab onto. So if they say anything that doesn't make sense relative to the official story, what happens is the filters that have been put into their brain filter that stuff out, and they ignore it, and they continue to stay on the official narrative talking points.
It's like in your recent presentation, Paul McCartney in that interview is like, we weren't very good, and it took us 12 weeks to write one song and these kind of things. I thought you were the Fab Four, you could shit 4 songs in a day kind of thing,
Yeah, well, that's the August 5th, 1966 BBC interview that John and Paul were at Paul's house, and the BBC interviewer was asking them questions. That was a very revealing interview. And Paul McCartney dropped big time bombs during that interview because the official narrative says that the Beatles were writing all the time. They were a perpetual motion machine of songwriting. So they were writing during their free time or vacation. They were writing in the studio. They were writing during films. They were writing songs while they were gigging and doing concerts. And then Paul McCartney in that interview says, no, we really didn't write any music between albums. Maybe one or two.
It's funny we talk about this. I was just watching there's this Facebook group, Cavern Club or something, and I think I sent you a couple of videos because they pop up quite often now. Billy Shears or whoever Beatles related material will get a minute clip, and he was it might have been even there was a Paul McCartney documentary released recently, 1, 2, 3 or something.
Hulu 3, 2, 1.
Yeah. So anyway, somewhere along the line there, he's talking about how back in the old days hear a song in his head and he didn't have anywhere to record it on tour, so you had to wake up the next morning, and if the song was still in your head, oh, it must have been memorable then. So this is how they just remembered it till they got to the recording studio. So it's as if they was trying to put out the story that they were writing on the road, you know. But then back then he's admitted that they weren't.
No, they weren't. You have to see, that's the thing. What amazes me, believing the Beatles' official narrative is like believing that a 300-pound guy with a white beard and a red suit can shimmy down a chimney. Okay? The Beatles story is a fairy tale for adults. And there was an interview that Pete Best did going back many years ago, and he was asked about playing in Hamburg and what was it like, and what was the schedule like. So Pete said, well, we would play 7 hours a night, then we would depart the club. They would go back to where they were hanging out, which in the early part of Hamburg, it was an old rundown cinema. And they would wake up at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and they had to be back at the venue, back at the club by 6 p.m. So if you're waking up at 3 p.m. and you have to be back at the club at 6 p.m., that's a 3-hour window. So were you writing songs during those 3 hours, or were you getting up, yawning, stretching, getting a bite to eat, taking a shower? They weren't writing songs.
This is supposedly they had 100 songs in the bag by the time they met George Martin, but yet none of them ever got recorded. And what happened to those songs?
That's right. So in the 80s documentary, The Complete Beatles, which was considered the Beatles documentary before Anthology was released in the 90s, it tells us that between Lennon and McCartney, whether together or separately, they wrote 100 songs between 1956 and 1962, yet none of them were recorded, which is very convenient, right? Yet when they meet George Martin, he said they had nothing behind them. And it wasn't obvious they were songwriters. He thought their music was rubbish. So we have to ask ourselves, that those 100 songs, where are they? Well, there's only two answers. One, if they wrote that many songs, they weren't very good. So that was that. Or two, the entire narrative is a fabrication. And that's what I believe. They didn't write 100 songs. The other thing, too, if you read Joseph Niezgoda's book, Lennon Prophecy, he talks about the fact that, because Hamburg, where they were, was in the red light district. And the Beatles were hanging out with the ladies. Yeah. And occasionally they had to be treated for an STD.
Yeah.
And, they were drinking and they were popping speed because of these gigs they were doing in Hamburg, 7 hours. And they were young guys. So they look, it's just a complete fairy tale, a complete fantasy to believe that those guys in that environment were writing songs. They weren't writing songs. And the proof of the pudding is when they met George Martin, they had no songs.
So do you think the Beatles were groomed to be the Beatles and they got sent to Hamburg for training, or was it naturally they were a group who went to Hamburg? Because they never really set the place on fire, did they, with Hamburg? I think
no.
The second time, and there was like, oh, shall we take them? Shall we leave them? Because the second point you made is the Beatles couldn't play their instruments. Well, obviously they could to a certain degree, but then you listen to even the early tracks. There's obviously a shit hot level of musicianship compared to some four guys just knocking the cover versions in drunken bars in Hamburg or whatever. So
yeah.
What's your take on that?
Well, when the Beatles first arrived in Hamburg in August of 1960, and they were not very good. Could they play their instruments? Yes, but we have to define playing skill. And their playing skills was not very good at all. So I'm often kind, and I say that their playing ability was mediocre at best. And they showed absolutely zero signs of songwriting ability. So they show up in Hamburg in August of 1960. I mean, they're very below average skilled band, and they're not songwriters. And in Joseph Niezgoda's book, Lennon Prophecy, going back to Joseph's book, he said when they departed Hamburg, in 1960 in December, they went home, John Lennon and Paul McCartney, dejected because nothing transpired. I mean, they were this young band, young guys. Like I said, they were in the red light district. They're playing in the club 7 hours a night. They're drinking. They're popping speed. They're hanging out with the ladies. What do you think was going to happen, right? So Hamburg, they went to Hamburg because I believe that the Beatles were in a program, and Hamburg was boot camp. So it was to take these 4 guys that were identified early on. How early, I don't know. In the presentation I just put up, I touch on it a little bit. We have to take a look at the family dynamics, especially between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. So you know, Billy, as well as I do, that when you take a look at people who wind up in programs, typically the family dynamic is dysfunctional. There is a parent that's not there anymore. Many times it's the mother. Sometimes it could be the father. Sometimes it's both parents. So there's a dynamic that is not normal in the family situation. So if we take a look at John Lennon, Lennon lost his mother at 17. His father was Freddie, was nowhere to be found. So he was raised by his Aunt Mimi. And the stories about Lennon and his disposition, this is not me saying this. This is well documented in mainstream books about the Beatles. He was an angry guy, and he had a chip on his shoulder. And, you know, that was who John Lennon was.
Quite a frictional relationship with Aunt Mimi. She was trying to control, and he was rebelling.
Yes. And also in Niezgoda's book, he says that Lennon had, you know, even back then, he had a dislike for Christianity. Okay, so that's Lennon. So we have this guy that's grappling with anger issues and all that. And then we have Paul McCartney, who lost his mother at 14 years old, his mother Mary. And he's then raised by his father. His father, you know, eventually got remarried. He had a stepmother. But there's very little information about both of Paul McCartney's biological parents, whether it be Mary or Jim, which I find personally very peculiar, very odd. So we have this guy who arguably, and some people would say it's not even an argument, is the most famous musician, quote, / entertainer in the world. Very, very well known. Yet there's no backstory and there's no information on his parents. But, you know, all we know about his father is that, you know, he had a little jazz band that he played in, and he had 2 jobs, one of which he worked a lathe machine. But that's pretty much it. And why is it just that? In fact, if you go to Paul McCartney's Wikipedia page, they talk about his parents. There's no hyperlink for his mother or his father. They have a hyperlink for everything else, but not for his mother and father. So what that tells me, and this, of course, this is speculation. This is telling me that there's something about the McCartney family structure that is not right. That's off. And I have suspected that his father was probably his handler and groomer from early on. Now, it tells us that Charlie's right here. In memoirs, it tells us that Paul was, you know, raised Catholic, but his father wanted him to move away from Catholicism, from Christianity. And the reason for that is because his father knew that where he was going, what they were grooming him for, was going to be an anti-Christian position.
Yeah.
So so what that tells us is, again, if this stuff is true, all right, well, we're never going to know for sure because, like I said, there's no information on Jim McCartney. Nobody's ever written a book about him, a biography. But in my view, between him, McCartney, and Lennon and their family backgrounds, something is off. And to me, that could lend itself to to two people at least. I'm not going to talk about George or Ringo because I don't have as much information on those two guys, but that they could very well have been in programs. And so by the time they got to Hamburg was the next step in their programming and their grooming.
I find it interesting, that's will be the case what you said, but if obviously the father knew what Paul was destined to do, I wonder if he knew about the sacrificial aspect to it. And also, when Billy Shears came back for the party, there's a video, and it just looks, like he is not even the black sheep of the family. He's a red horse or something. He's just not part of that family. But they've got the cameras on and they're trying to pretend that he is. So why wouldn't his father be put on more of a show if he was fully in the plan? Obviously he must have let them in somehow.
Yeah, I think Jim McCartney was Freemason. I'll just cut to the chase. That's what I believe. And, all this stuff, Billy, as you know, is compartmentalized. So I'm not saying Jim had the big picture. Jim had a part of the picture that he was allowed to know in which to operate within. And I think it's possible that his job was to groom his son, handle him, and bring him along until Paul got to the next bus stop where somebody else would pick him up and wind up, picking up the grooming and the training and the handling. So that's what I think. And also, Paul McCartney, Billy, but we'll say Paul McCartney, did not attend Jim McCartney's funeral back in 1976. Now, the reason for that, given, is that his stepmother, Jim's second wife, said, well, if you come, it's going to be disruptive because, your presence, because of who you are, this and that and all that. And Billy had a tour coming up. But in the presentation, I don't know if you got to that part, I said, well, it seems to me that if your parent died, especially when you allegedly loved that parent and you had a lot of praise for them, which Billy did do with regard to Jim McCartney, that you would postpone the start of the tour for maybe a day or two or whatever because of a family death. And there are ways to pay your respects without showing up with fanfare. I mean, you sneak in, right? You do what you've got to do. I mean, come on. I mean, this is not hard stuff. You and I could figure this out. So the reason why he didn't go to Jim's funeral is because Jim was not his father, plain and simple. I mean, it's really, that's the explanation. So, as we're talking about this and people are listening, you can gather that there's a lot of crazy stuff that's embedded in this whole Beatles backstory. It's not the story that you're told.
It's
I'm
when
talking
Billy
to the audience.
is talking, he occasionally gets asked about his father, and he's got these kind of rote things that he says because he's obviously had to read up. So he's, we're in this living room and he would be playing this Chicago and these old standard songs or whatever, and then you hear another interview 5 years later and it's the same stories coming out of him. I know we kind of hold on to stories and kind of repeat them, but it almost seems like he's learned a lot and then that's the ones he tells at certain times to fill in the backstory.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Right.
Well, in Memoirs, it explains that in the beginning, Billy was tutored on Paul's history.
Yeah.
But there's only so much you can tutor somebody about somebody's life. And it gets to the point, it's admitted in the book, where he says that I started making stuff up. I just started making stories up. And I found that I could say just about anything and nobody would question me. Right. They would just accept it at face value. So that's where, it went from being schooled on as much of Paul's backstory that he could possibly be schooled on to, all right, well, I can't possibly know everything, so I'll just make shit up.
And nobody else knows it anyway. And
right.
Probably drop in a few clues just because he's got that perverse kind of sense of humor or whatever it is, I think he likes to do that, drop in, as you say, masterfully speaking, to say a few things without actually saying it.
Yeah, I mean, he masterfully speaks all the time, and the best one probably of all time was the David Letterman show back in 2009. I mean, come on, So anyway, I derailed you there, Billy. So going back to the questions, was another one? What was the other
the second one was done. The Beatles couldn't play their instruments, so we kind of touched on that just by them going to Hamburg. They were playing a bit, but then see when they became famous and they had the amazing singles, whatever, and they're still touring. Do you think there was a backing band behind the curtain there and they were miming? Because again, we've seen George Harrison do that and he lift his hand up and the guitar solo is still going.
Yeah. So let me just remind me to go back to that. Let me just say first about the Beatles' ability to play the instruments. The objective of the training, that the boot camp in Hamburg and all the gigging that they were doing, in 1961, starting in January throughout the entire year, the Beatles did a gig 62% of the year. So 62% of the number of days in a year, so 250 days out of 365 days, the Beatles were doing some kind of live gig. Now, we have to keep in mind that this is a band that in the previous year, between August and December of 1960, I mean, it was nothing happened. Zero happened. So we have to ask the question, well, if a band that is not very good, has no resume, is not well known. In fact, their reputation is that of not a very good band at all. Who's booking them? Why are these clubs booking them? Right. So that's when we start to see that there has to be some kind of machine behind them. Now, Hamburg and all that playing going back to 1961, playing almost 2/3 of the year, doing live gigs, was about getting their playing abilities to the point where they were competent enough to be able to take the songs that they were going to be taught on the road. That's what it was about. It was about getting them to a level of competency where they could play the songs that they were taught to take out on the world stage once Beatlemania kicked off. What they were doing in Hamburg had nothing to do with getting them to the point where they were so skilled that they would be at studio musician levels and that they would actually be in the studio laying down the recordings. Because in the studio, what happens is, especially back in the day, and it's still like this today, the studio musicians will come in, sheet music is put in front of them, and they play. And they're banging out a number of songs in a given period of time. So they bang out one song, then they go to the next one, to the next one, to the next one. And it doesn't even have to be songs that are on the same album. It could be, okay, now we've got, this song that's going to be for this artist, and boom. And, they play it. They're very competent. They're extremely good at what they do, very efficient. And so that's how it's done. So that's the going back to the Beatles, that's why they weren't in the studio. First of all, none of them could read or write music, aside from Billy. So there's no sense putting sheet music in front of them, because it would be like handing them a sheet of paper written in Chinese.
Yeah.
And in the studio, when you're sitting around a bunch of other studio musicians, you can't be just sitting there trying to figure stuff out or fumbling along. No, that's not going to work. They're going to throw your ass out the door.
Yeah.
So go back to your question. What was it? I forgot.
Just the second point was they couldn't play their instruments. So, there was like with the backing band, or was there backing tapes, or were they actually playing, Live at the Apollo, or, the Queen rattling their jewelry and all this kind of stuff?
Yeah. So there comes in three flavors. The first flavor is there were times when they went on stage and they played live. Now, whether those live performances sounded any good, I don't know. They would probably sounded adequate. I believe
at the time weren't that good, and they had everyone screaming, so that would cover it up.
Well, people are screaming, and also there are points when those performances, there was no intention to take those performances and record them, whether audio or visual, and make anything out of it. So, it's just kind of like, a lot of bands are like this, right? So they go out, they were gigging forever. Is every performance filmed or recorded? Absolutely not. So I think a lot of those performances, they just were blank sheets of paper from the standpoint of recording and filming, because the intention was not to film them. The intention was to get them competent enough to be able to play songs that they were going to be fed later on. Now, other times, once things evolved and they started to get traction and they were becoming more well-known, then what happened was they would be playing to backing tracks. Right. So if it were larger venues and these venues had a high level profile as far as audience reach, then they played to backing tracks. And this is not uncommon. This is the other thing. People think it's heresy to say this, especially when you're talking about the Beatles, but performances on television and playing to backing tracks, that's just the way it was done. So people want to argue with me that when the Beatles were on the Ed Sullivan Show, they played live. I said, absolutely not. They did not play live. Do you think for 1 second that the Beatles handlers were going to put them on the Ed Sullivan Show, which was it was the show, right, variety and entertainment show back in the day? Do you think that they were going to take a chance where they were taking the Beatles, that they would pray and hope, throw a Hail Mary, that they wouldn't flub or that something didn't go right? No, that was all a backing track. In fact, I have a video of the Dave Clark Five. They were on the Ed Sullivan Show. And the Dave Clark Five, I would say, musically were better than the Beatles. Yeah. And there was a video where they started playing and the backing track failed. Right. And the Dave Clark Five is sitting on stage, holding their instruments and kind of looking around like, okay, let's do this again. So that's how it is. And then we have situations where the Beatles, as an example, when they played at Shea Stadium, where they performed at Shea Stadium to a screaming crowd. It's to your point. It doesn't matter how good or how poorly you play when you're at Shea Stadium with 50,000 screaming people, because nobody can hear you anyway. So all you could do, you're just strumming. Nobody's really hearing anything. They're singing through the PA system at the stadium. What happened with the Shea Stadium performance is afterwards, it was worked on post-production in the studio. Yeah. Now, the proof of this is in the October 1965 edition of Beatles Book, which was an official Beatles publication. Brian Epstein talked about the fact that the Beatles had to go back into the studio and dub the vocals because of the noise level at Shea Stadium. Here's the problem with what Brian said. First of all, he's correct. Because of the noise level and the noise bleed, there's no way you could have gotten clean vocals. But other instruments, aside from the vocals, were mic'd on the stage. So if the noise level was at a point where it was impeding a clear recording of the vocals, then it was also going to be a problem for the guitars, the bass, the drums, and anything else that was mic'd on stage and wasn't going direct line into the mixer. So that tells me that the entire Shea Stadium performance, when people watch it on YouTube, that is not the performance that you heard if you were there. Yeah. What you're watching and listening to is a post-production enhanced video. A listener of mine, very astute, he was comparing two Beatles concerts from 1966. One was Dodger Stadium, and I think the other one was Candlestick Park. And he found that what the Beatles did, but what the Beatles machine did was to lay in an actual backing track into both those concerts. And the playing was identical. Right. Identical. Now, here's the thing, too. If you're playing live, the possibility that you're going to get a song played identically is pretty much impossible. Even if you don't make a mistake or there's no different way of doing the chord changes, or maybe Ringo drummed a different fill or whatever. Let's just say everything else was mapped perfectly between the two concerts. The problem is the beats per minute, is the tempo.
Yeah.
So the probability that you can play a song at an average of 120 beats per minute in one concert, and then have it 120 beats per minute in the second concert, is highly unlikely. Highly unlikely, because during a live performance, what happens is, unless you have a super, super tight band, like studio players that are just like, they are in the pocket, they're on the beat, the band has a tendency to speed up, slow down, speed up, slow down. In fact, Billy talked about this in an interview we did with George Martin in a documentary called Produced by George Martin. And Billy specifically called Ringo out for doing that he would speed up when they were playing. So that's the other thing. So backing tracks. And also there were situations where there were ringers or studio musicians playing backstage.
Yeah.
Right. And we saw that with their concert in Japan in 1966, Budokan. And you mentioned they raised their hand, and that was George Harrison. He was waving to somebody. He was playing "If I Needed Someone," and he's raising his hand, and yet the guitar is still playing. And the best one was during that Budokan concert footage is Day Tripper. So Day Tripper begins, and neither George nor John are playing the riff, and then they catch up.
Yeah. Oh, supposed to be playing.
I had somebody write me, and I know who this person is. I'm not going to say the person's name, but they are a studio musician, and they claim to have actually been on studio tracks going back to Apple Studios back in the day. And this person told me that he used to do that work, not for the Beatles, he said, but for other bands. He would be hired to play backstage or off stage and actually play the guitar parts, while he said his words were something to the effect, the pretty faces were miming on stage. I had another guy write me, and I think he played for Dave Mason. I don't quote me on that, but he said that his father, I should say, not him, but his father, and he told me that his father did exactly that for a concert for the Beatles, and he was a drummer, so he was backstage doing Ringo's parts, and Ringo was miming. So that's how it worked, and we have to understand, folks, that this is not picking on the Beatles per se. But some people are going to say, yeah, it is, Mike, you're tearing into the Beatles. No, it's putting the Beatles into the proper context, because this is how it works in the music industry. There's so much information coming out now about big name bands like Aerosmith and Kiss and other bands.
I recently watched ZZ Top, who I thought were shit hot, and but honestly, they weren't even trying. It was like so unbelievably lackluster fucking miming going on, and it was just obvious it was miming, and it was just like, you could at least put some effort into it. It was like they couldn't be arsed, or just what I mean. It was mind-boggling to actually witness it.
Yeah, I mean, they're using backing tracks, Motley Crue, and this has been going on for a very, very long time.
I actually went to see a band, Sisters of Mercy, and I left the concert halfway through because I was like, these guys are amazing. They're famous for having lots of smoke on the stage.
Yes.
And that's just to cover up. And basically, there's these two folk, there's a guitar player and bass player, are just posing. I was like, they aren't actually playing. It's just, what I mean? It was so fake. And the two songs I really liked from them, they were still to get played at the end. I just never waited for it. I just walked out, and there's somebody else was walking out as well. And they've got a reputation for being a shit live band, and that's probably why, because folk kind of sense that they're not actually performing, I don't think, Yeah,
I had the same experience when I saw the 40th anniversary of Foreigner. This goes back, several years ago, and it was like 2 songs in, and I'm watching the big screens, and I knew immediately that they were miming. Here's another example. A lot of Thin Lizzy fans out there. I used to listen to Thin Lizzy. Yeah,
their live album was totally
Live
dumb.
and Dangerous. Yeah, so they Live and Dangerous, and if you go on, it's on Wikipedia. This is not like a mystery.
One live album of the year.
It was Tony Visconti, their producer, said that 75% of the album was redone in the studio. And he said it had to get done in order to present a professional band to the audience. So going back to my point, Billy, I'm not crapping on the Beatles. I'm putting them within the proper context of how the industry operates, how they work. Not a whole lot has changed.
They released an album. I can remember my friend way back in the day having the Shea Stadium Beatles vinyl. So they couldn't have released that in its obviously basic recorded version. So they wanted to put it out. And that John Lennon recently was talking about it was a happening because he kind of knew, I think, it was shit. So he said that was just a happening. But yeah, if they want to get a product to make money, Shea Stadium, famous Beatles concert, well, they need to be shit hot to sell.
Yeah. Let's. I mean, look, bands are a product. Okay, they're selling a product to us, and you're going to make sure that product is as buffed up and polished up as it can possibly be, so that you buy it, so that you buy their merch, so you buy their music.
Glass with lots of holes in it. Well, you better patch the holes up so it doesn't.
Right. Now we had the last question. I think had to do with Adorno. Yes.
Yeah, Theodore Adorno wrote all of their music.
Yeah. Okay. So this one really gets under my skin because there was stuff on the internet going back years ago that claimed that Theodore Adorno wrote all of the Beatles' music, and this actually was sourced from John Coleman's book, The Committee of 300, because this is a claim that Coleman made. And although I respect John Coleman's work, when he talks about the deep state, and people want to disagree with me, I always say, well, tell me where John Coleman got it wrong as far as how the deep state operates. We're talking about the control system.
Yeah.
Okay, he didn't get it wrong. He was 100% right. But when he talked about Adorno in the Frankfurt School, and he said that Adorno wrote all of their music, I disagreed with him. And I spell this out, going back to my big presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music, in April of 2020. I very, very diligently explain why it is I disagreed with this. And one of the reasons was because Adorno was doing other stuff. His books were being written, he was doing TV appearances, and he was doing all his strategizing with his Frankfurt cohorts and all of this. So I thought, okay, well, the possibility that, and he is a skilled composer, okay, so, but I thought, well, the possibility that this guy was sitting down and he was writing every song of the Beatles, I found to be highly unlikely. And so I'm going to explain, again, how I believe this worked. I believe that Adorno was indeed involved in the Beatles. So he was the major stakeholder representing the ideology of the Frankfurt School and Tavistock. So we'll just roll it in under Tavistock for the sake of argument. And that he was working directly with George Martin. And George Martin would be considered, like in a corporate structure, he would be considered the managing director of the operation. So you had Adorno and here, and you had Martin here. So that was the reporting structure. And then below that, I suspect the way it worked was there were probably a half dozen, maybe 6 crack songwriters from the Tavistock EMI staff that were dedicated to the Beatles' music. And, of that half a dozen group of people, let's say half of them were responsible for writing, quote, John Lennon style music, and the other half was responsible for writing Paul McCartney style music. Now, that doesn't mean that Adorno and George Martin were not also writing songs. My point is that I highly doubt that Theodore Adorno wrote all of their music. That's a very bold statement to make.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's how I think it worked. It was an operation that had its songwriters, and it had two guys that were managing the operation, Adorno and George Martin, and I suspect that we could put Phil Spector into that mix as well. So Spector would be more from the operational aspect of getting the songs recorded.
Engineer.
If he was involved. Yeah, he would be kind of he would also be producing, but in all likelihood, the final say as far as production went to George Martin. Spector admits that Martin was arranging the music, that he was responsible for that. But I think Phil, again, if Phil was involved, and I believe that it's likely that he was, his job was to get the songs recorded, to get the players in and get the songs recorded. And for people who want to question whether tapes can be shipped back and forth, Bernard Purdy explained it. Bernard Purdy said he drummed on 21 Beatle tracks, and Bernard did drum on 21 tracks. It wasn't the Tony Sheridan tracks. He drummed on both. He was paid to fix some of the Tony Sheridan songs that the Beatles played on, but he clearly played on 21 Beatle tracks. And Bernard explained that he did the fixing, the drumming overdubs, at Capitol Studios in New York City. And which means that tapes were sent over. I was also told by somebody in the industry that the whole story about the Beatles only having access to 2-track machines, EMI Parlophone, he said that story is not true. He said that back in the day, they clearly had at least 4-track capabilities. Also, when I explained that Bernard did his fixing or his overdubbing at Capitol Studios, which was owned by EMI, by the way. Capitol was owned by EMI. Somebody in the comment section said, there was no Capitol Studios in New York City. And I think to myself, why don't people research something before they type something out? So to be able to figure out whether Capitol Studios actually existed in the 1960s, the early 1960s, is a very simple process. I mean, you just do a search on it and boom, it pops up. You know, by the mid to, let's say, 1966 period, it was being phased out. But when Bernard was doing the overdubbing back, let's say 1963, maybe going into 64, Capitol Studios was clearly in operation in New York City. And in one interview, Bernard said that the drumming that he did was the first 3 albums. So that would be Please Please Me, which I think Andy White probably drummed on most of that. He said 21 songs. So that would mean that with the Beatles, Bernard had a big part in that, and also A Hard Day's Night. So that would mean that Bernard was probably all over A Hard Day's Night. And that's not to say that he didn't drum on other songs later on, but I recall in one interview he mentioned the first 3 albums.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think a little bit this fixing thing, like when the Stones recorded Exile in France. I seen a documentary where kind of it went to America for final production or whatever, and I think there's probably fixing, you know, they've got scraps of songs and ideas or whatever. I don't know, it's obviously a thing in the business, isn't it, to fix stuff.
Yeah.
So it probably went to these types of studios with these musicians to, you know, make them professional, basically.
Billy, I fix my own stuff. This is what you have to not you, I'm talking to the audience, this is what you have to understand, is that, here's an example, right? So because I'm doing this at home, I have an Alesis SR18 drum machine, and I have to program it to put the drum patterns in. So there have been times when I did the drum pattern, and I'm thinking, okay, this is it. And then I start to lay down the guitar tracks, the bass, the keyboards, and all that stuff. And as the song is coming together, I think to myself, the drums probably should do this here versus what I have. So what do I have to do? I have to go back and reprogram the drum machine. I have to sync it up and put down new drum patterns. So this happens all the time. It also happens if you lay a guitar part down. And let's say the guitar part is good, but you don't like the tone. You think the tone could be brighter. There's nothing wrong with the way it was played, but you're just not liking the way it's coming across in playback. So what happens? You go back and you fix it, which means you go back and you re-record it, you overdub a new guitar track, and you change the brightness based upon when you're playing an acoustic guitar. It depends upon where the microphone is positioned between the sound hole and the 12th fret. Yeah. So this is not like mysterious, weird stuff. This is what gets done.
People have got 2 weeks in a studio. They go in there and do what they can. 2 weeks is finished. They've got something almost like demos, or
right,
a good version of it, but needs something to take it up that next level. So send it to that guy. He can fix it. Comes back ready to be produced and sold.
Yeah. What happens is the producer has the final say. Yeah. Unless the band is really high powered, A-list, been in the business a long time. It's the producer. That's why you have a producer. So the producer will listen to the tracks, listen to the song, and then say, okay, that's not working. It needs to sound like this. And so they call in the ringers. They call in the studio players to lay down the tracks that they want.
I don't know if you're aware, there's a band Oasis who have recently reformed. So anyway, when they recorded their first album, they had at least 2 stabs at it, and the owner of Creation Records would say, this doesn't sound like you live, it's not good enough. But they were saying, well, that's the best we can do, fucking take it or leave it kind of thing. So they ended up sending it to this other engineer or whatever, and he's turned all the dials up and everything, and he's found a way to kind of make the record what it was. But at that point, the bands had washed their hands of it. Right. But he's literally the one that's made that from an album that probably would have been under the radar or, became a cult thing or whatever, to literally, a million-selling album just by his overproduction to make it sound nothing like what had been recorded, but maybe like them live or whatever. So that's one example of something like that.
I have a friend of mine who has been following my work for a long time, and I love him. He's a good guy, and he's a professional sound engineer out of Europe. And he showed me, going back, I don't know, maybe 3 years ago or so, some work that he was doing where it was a band, I'm not going to say who the band is, where there was a live recording of them performing. And he showed me a before and after. This is what they sounded like before we took the tapes into the studio to enhance them. And it's amazing. Even, the audience, if they will add in audience applause, responses to enhance a portion of the song, or to make the song appear to be, it was performed in such a way that the audience went nuts. They went wild, It's all showbiz.
Yeah.
It's all show business. And the Beatles were not exempt from this. And and when I do talk about it, people get very agitated, as the Beatle fans, because they want to believe the Cinderella story. They want to believe that the Beatles were the exception to every rule, and they were not.
The last point you made was, you said, and remind me to pull up a critique of the Beatles by the great jazz artist Charles Mingus.
Yes. Okay. So let me pull that up real quick. I've got that. Bear with me 1 second, Billy. Okay. So I think this is it. Okay. So Charles Mingus is considered one of the great jazz musicians of all time. He's been dead a long time. Unfortunately for him, this is what the article says, the mainstream popularity of jazz was in deep decline at the same time as the Beatles were shooting for fame. So he went on to say that they, meaning the Beatles, the machine behind the Beatles, they stole what we call rock. So in other words, he's saying that rock lifted from the jazz musicians and the R&B musicians. They studied it, not the Beatles. He says, the Beatles didn't do this. He said, who did it were some of the great classic minds from England. All right? So his quote here is a little disjointed. So let me just read so far what he's got. He said, they stole what we call rock, studied it, not the Beatles, meaning the Beatles didn't steal it. And it was done by some of the great classical minds from England. So when you think about the great classical minds of England, we're talking about people who know that type of music. Well, two people I just mentioned would be Theodore Adorno and George Martin.
Yeah.
And those are two that I talk about.
Yeah.
It's quite possible that there was a cadre of others who were tied in. And he goes on to say, and they built the Beatles, and the Beatles were a machine. And they promised these kids so much money, meaning they promised the Beatles money, and they trained them.
Right.
He said they were not musicians when they came. They became musicians in 4 or 5 years after they learned. In other words, after they were taught. So this is very interesting because Charles Mingus was saying what I'm saying way before I ever said it. And what he's telling us is that the Beatles were manufactured. And I also concluded that the Beatles in the very beginning musically were not very good, but as time evolved, they were able to find themselves playing on more of their recorded songs. And like I said, from Sgt. Pepper on, mostly the White Album, going out through Let It Be. But this is Charles Mingus, and for anybody who wants to take a look at who he was, look him up on Wikipedia. We're not talking about a guy who's a schlep. We're talking about a great, great jazz musician. And that was his take.
I was going to mention there's quite a few Beatles songs, maybe towards the end especially, Hey Jude and stuff like that, that were lifted from like Italian opera, or you can pick up...
Hey Jude.
Was it Hey Jude? Yeah.
Yesterday.
Yeah, so obviously...
Italian Neapolitan songs.
Somebody who knows that stuff, you wouldn't imagine these 4 guys from Liverpool are studying that. So, you know what I mean? They've taken those songs and maybe even Billy, I don't know. But
that's why, Billy, in the narrative, they have to cover that angle of it. And the narrative will say that Paul McCartney, he would visit Brian Epstein, and Paul really enjoyed listening to classical music.
Right. Okay.
Bullshit. Okay. I mean, that guy, he wasn't listening to classical music, but that's inserted into the narrative because otherwise people would say, well, Eleanor Rigby, how'd that come about? For no one? All of these songs you could start to bring into the equation and say, well, okay, so a guy that was like, I don't know, 22, 23, 24 years old,
right.
he had the musical ability, inclinations to put these songs together. Oh no, well, he wrote them on guitar, and then George Martin did the arrangement and all this stuff. And, I mean, it just becomes very convoluted. It's Occam's razor. What's the most reasonable explanation? The most reasonable explanation is the person who wrote those songs and put them together is somebody who understands that style and genre of music. I mean, that's how I look at it.
Like when that guy was sitting on the piano beside George Martin talking about Blackbird.
Howard Goodall.
And saying, like, how did he do this? And you could see George Martin going, shut the fuck
up. That was Howard Goodall. And I can't believe that interview, that's in the documentary produced by George Martin. So what Billy's talking about is Howard Goodall, who is a composer himself and extremely competent and skilled and accomplished. and he's sitting at the piano, and he asks George Martin to sit next to him, and he's asking George Martin about these songs, like the influence, the way these songs are structured. He talked about For No One, and it was Blackbird. I think Yesterday was another song. Eleanor Rigby came into the discussion, and he was asking George, well, is this like your influence? And as he's asking George this, did you notice that George also, he stiffened up like this when he got asked the question? And then as Howard Goodall continues to go on and ask about these songs and how they actually got written and who actually was putting them together, like you said, George does this. It's the Masonic hand gesture for tell no secrets the whole time. And Howard keeps going, which is, it's kind of humorous because it's quite clear that George Martin is saying, please stop asking me these questions. Let's move on. Right. And then George Martin goes back to it's just
Paul and John. It's just Paul and John.
No, it's John and Paul. I mean, it wasn't me. You know? It's like, but it was so funny the way the whole thing went down. Maybe, I'll send you the clip. I have that clip. There's just so much in the story. Like when you read between the lines.
It's interesting they've kept it in the documentary, though. You know what I mean?
I know. I was shocked that they kept it in there. And the only thing I could think of, Billy, is that there is that balancing of the scales that Luciferians have, where they have all this deception and all of these lies, but they think that from a karma perspective, I mean, I'm not really sure it works this way, but at least in their minds, they think they're covered. If they put some truth out there and they balance the scales, then from a karmic perspective, they think they're good. Right. Like I could do all of this bad shit, but then if I do good stuff, and by the way, how do you know that the scales are balanced? Who makes that determination?
Right.
Jimmy
Savile did a lot of good work for charity.
Exactly. Is there a Luciferian council that says, okay, show me, okay, I know your bad stuff, show me the good stuff you did. Yeah, we think you're good. You're good. It's really very strange.